There is a place in the American Southwest where the ground opens up more than a mile deep, and the rock at the very bottom of it is the oldest exposed stone on the surface of the continent. Geologists gave that basement rock a name almost a century and a half ago, and the name they chose was not American, and it was not the name of any tribe or any settler or any president. They called it the Vishnu Schist. Above it they raised names out of the same strange impulse, one temple after another, and they carved those names onto the government maps where they still sit today. There is a formation in the canyon they named Isis Temple. There is one they named Osiris Temple. And there is a great red mass they named the Tower of Ra, and beside it a darker one they named the Tower of Set. There is a Buddha temple and a Brahma temple and a Shiva temple and a Zoroaster temple, and there is a broad flat height they named for the god of the Egyptian dead. A person could stand on the south rim of the Grand Canyon at sunrise and look out across a landscape that carries the names of the oldest gods of the old world, and almost nobody who stands there ever asks the obvious question, which is why? Why did the men who mapped a canyon in Arizona reach halfway around the planet and pull the names of drowned religions up out of the dust to hang them on American stone? The easy answer is that they were educated men with a taste for the exotic, and that is the answer you will be given if you ask. It is a reasonable answer. It is also an answer that stops exactly where the interesting part begins. Because when you set those names down next to what a much older people wrote on clay 4,000 years before any surveyor ever saw the Colorado River, the coincidence starts to feel less like a coincidence and more like an echo. The Sumerians, who were the first people on Earth to write anything down at all, left behind a body of warnings about the deep places of the world. They wrote about what lives beneath the ground. They wrote about a domain under the earth that was sealed by the gods themselves, sealed on purpose, sealed against us. And they wrote about what would happen to the human race if that seal were ever broken. And in 7 separate places, on 7 separate matters, across tablets that were pressed and baked and buried and dug back up thousands of years later, they left something that reads less like poetry and more like a caution handed down from people who had already seen the thing go wrong once. This is a documentary about those 7 warnings, and about the canyon that seems to answer them. To understand why any of this should raise the hair on the back of your neck, you have to understand who the Sumerians actually were, because the schoolbook version does them a quiet violence. It files them under primitive. It files them under early. Yet it puts them at the bottom of the ladder of progress. The fumbling first step, the people who came before, the people who mattered. That picture is wrong. And every serious historian of the ancient Near East knows it is wrong. The Sumerians were not the bottom of the ladder. As far as the written record of the human species reaches, they were the top of it, the origin point. The ones who were already there when everyone else arrived. There is Sumer, and then there is everything that came after Sumer, and the distance between those two things is the distance between silence and speech. They invented writing. Not a form of writing, not a regional style of writing, but the act itself, the very technology that lets these words reach you across time. They pressed a cut reed into wet clay in the flat, hot country between the Tigris and the Euphrates, and in doing so, they became the first human beings who could speak to people they would never meet, including us. They invented the wheel that turns under every vehicle you have ever ridden in. But they invented the plow that turned a salt marsh into the breadbasket of the ancient world. They cut the hour into 60 minutes and the minute into 60 seconds. And that division still governs the clock on your wall and the phone in your hand right now, more than 4,000 years after the men who chose the number 60 went into the ground. They mapped the movements of the planets with a precision that later astronomers spent millennia trying to match. Now they wrote the first laws, the first contracts, the first love songs, the first lullabies, and the first complaint letters, including a famous one from a man who was furious about receiving the wrong grade of copper. These were not simple people. These were the founders of the entire human project of remembering things on purpose. So when a people like that, the people who taught the rest of us how to keep a record, sit down and press a warning into clay and take the trouble to bake it hard so that it will survive, the correct response is not to laugh. The correct response is to lean in and read it very carefully, because whatever else they were not careless, and they were not in the habit of writing things down for no reason. Their tablets are tax records and star charts and legal rulings. They are the furthest thing from idle. And scattered through that vast, serious archive, there is a thread of something darker, a set of statements about the world beneath the world, and about a thing that was put down there and shut away, and about the danger of ever bringing it back up into the light. The people who first noticed this thread were not, at the start, treasure hunters or television hosts. They were translators. They were the philologists of the 1800s and the early 1900s who taught themselves to read a dead script off broken clay, working by lamplight in the back rooms of museums, and who found themselves copying out sentences that made them deeply uncomfortable. Still, they found a creation story in which human beings are manufactured, deliberately, as a labor force, by beings who came down from the sky. They found a flood story, older than the one in their own Bibles, with the same ark and the same survivor and the same bird sent out to find dry land, except that in the older version, the flood is not a punishment for sin. It is an extermination order, given by a ruler who has simply decided that the human race has become too numerous and too loud and too aware, and who wants us gone. They found lists of kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years before a great flood swept the whole arrangement away. And they found again and again the insistence that certain things had been locked below and were to stay locked below, and that the sealing of the deep was one of the founding acts of the ordered world. Most of them did what careful scholars are trained to do. They called it mythology, filed it, and moved on. A few of them could not let it go. And in the centuries since, a second tradition has grown up alongside the academic one, a tradition that takes these tablets at something closer to their word, that asks what it would actually mean if the first writers on Earth were not inventing their gods but reporting them. That second tradition is where this story lives. It does not ask you to abandon your judgment. It asks you to hold two things in your mind at once, the mainstream reading and the older stranger reading, and to notice the places where the second one refuses to sit down and be quiet. The Grand Canyon is one of those places. Not because of the geology, which is genuine and staggering and needs no help from anyone. The canyon is a real wound in the earth cut by a real river over an unimaginable span of time, and the science of how it formed is some of the most solid science we have. The strangeness is not in the rock. Then the strangeness is in the human record that has gathered around the rock like fog. It is in the names on the maps. It is in a newspaper story from the spring of 1909 that a real newspaper really did print on its front page, a story about an underground city found inside the canyon walls. A story that has been argued about ever since and that will not die no matter how many times it is declared dead. And it is in the fact that some of the most suggestively named formations in that canyon sit in areas that ordinary people are quietly discouraged from ever reaching. The strangeness is in the pattern, and the pattern is what this documentary is about. Here is how the next 3 hours will go. We are going to take 7 warnings that the Sumerians left behind about the sealed deep, and we are going to lay each one down next to the Grand Canyon and see what happens. The first warning is about a place they called the Abzu, a domain of fresh water and darkness beneath the solid ground, ruled by the one God who was on our side, and sealed even so. The second is about 7 beings who came up out of that deep to teach the human race everything it knows, and who were sent back down and shut away when the teaching was done. Yet the third is about a gate with a guardian, and a hero who forced it open, and what came through. The fourth is about the flood, and the terrible possibility that the flood was not a disaster but a method, a way of burying something so that it could never be found. The fifth is about a list of drowned cities and impossible kings, and where a buried age might still be lying. But the sixth is about a set of forbidden decrees, the operating instructions of reality itself, that were stolen and fought over and finally locked away where no one could reach them. And the seventh is about the Gate of the Dead, the place with 7 doors and 7 locks. And the reason, the actual stated reason, that the whole thing had to be sealed in the first place. None of this is comfortable. Some of it will sound, at first, like the sort of thing sensible people are supposed to wave away. Keep listening anyway, because the discomfort is the point. The Sumerians were not trying to comfort anyone. They were trying to leave a note. And the note says in 7 different ways that there is a door in the deep places of the world, and that it was closed for a reason, and that the reason has not gone away just because we forgot it was ever written down. Before we go down those stairs together, you should know who left the warnings and how we know they left them, because the strangeness of that is part of the story. The Sumerians were the first people on Earth to write. They lived in the flat hot land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in the south of what is now Iraq, more than 4,000 years ago, and before them, as far as the record shows, no human being had ever pressed words into a surface and made them stay. They invented the city, now they invented writing. They invented the school, the law code, the epic, the temple that reached at the sky. And then their world ended. Their cities dried up as the rivers shifted and the soil turned to salt, their language died, and the mounds of their buried towns sat in the desert for thousands of years with no one left alive who could read a single mark they had made. Their gods were forgotten. Their kings were forgotten. Even their name was very nearly forgotten. And then, within the last 2 centuries, men with shovels dug into those mounds and pulled out hundreds of thousands of clay tablets covered in a wedge-shaped script no living person could read, And over decades of brilliant and stubborn work, the script gave up its secret, and the dead language spoke again, and the human race got back the words of its first writers after a silence of thousands of years. Everything you are about to hear comes from those recovered words. This is not a tradition passed down and embroidered through the ages. It is a signal from the very beginning of writing, buried, lost, and only recently dug up and read, which makes it less like a legend and more like a message in a sealed bottle, written at the dawn of history and opened in our own time. And when the message was opened, when the tablets were read, one of the first things that came out of them was a family of mighty beings that the Sumerians and the Babylonians after them placed at the center of everything, beings they called, among other names, the Anunnaki. The name appears again and again across the oldest texts. The Anunnaki are the great gods, the ones who decree the fates, the ones who sit in judgment, and in the oldest stories they are bound up specifically with the earth and with the below, with the deep and with the underworld, and with the sealed places beneath the solid ground. It was these beings, the texts say, who shaped the human race, and who ruled the first cities, and who sent the flood, and who sit as the judges of the dead at the bottom of the world. In our own time, the name Anunnaki has been pulled into a whole modern mythology of ancient astronauts and visitors from the sky, a mythology this documentary will lay out fairly, and will also, just as fairly, hold up against the objections of the scholars who study these texts for a living. But strip all of that away, set aside every modern claim, and go back to the tablets themselves, and you still find this, plainly, in the oldest words we can read. A family of great powers, associated with the deep and the below, who bound something dangerous at the foundation of the world, who buried a first age under a flood, and who keep the door of the dead. That much is simply what the Sumerians wrote. What it means is where the argument begins, and they wrote it, over and over, in sevens. The number runs through their picture of the sealed deep like a structural beam. 7 sages came up from the deep to teach. 7 layers of terrifying radiance wrapped the guardian of the forbidden place. Still, 7 antediluvian cities held the kingship before the flood. 7 gates locked the descent to the underworld, and at each one something is stripped away. This documentary is built as 7 warnings, not because 7 makes a tidy list, but because 7 is the number the Sumerians themselves stamped onto the architecture of the sealed below, again and again, until you cannot read their deep places without walking through 7s. So we will walk through them in order. 7 warnings, each one anchored in a specific text that real scholars have really translated from real tablets. And each one, strangely, uncomfortably, finding its echo in the same place on the far side of the world, in the walls and names and stories of a single canyon in Arizona, whose peaks are called after the drowned and buried gods of the old world. I will show you the tablets, and I will show you the canyon, and where the modern claims run ahead of the evidence, I will tell you so. And where the evidence is genuinely stranger than the debunking allows, I will tell you that too. My promise to you is only this, that I will keep the record and the speculation clearly separated so that at the end you can decide for yourself which is which, and how much of the fit between the oldest warnings and the deepest canyon is coincidence, and how much is something else. One more thing, before the stairs. You will notice, as we go, that the fit between the Sumerian warnings and this one canyon keeps getting tighter than it has any right to be, and you will feel, more than once, the temptation to decide the whole thing at a stroke, to call it all coincidence and be done, or to call it all proof and believe. Resist both for the length of this journey. The honest response to a pattern this strange is not to collapse it early in either direction, but to hold it open, to let each of the 7 warnings stand on its own evidence, to weigh the record against the speculation warning by warning, and to arrive at the end with the whole shape in view before you decide what it is. That is the only fair way to treat something that sits, as this does, right on the uncomfortable line between the documented and the impossible. So hold your verdict. Let the 7 speak. And watch what happens to the canyon as they do. Let us begin where they began, at the edge of the water, at the top of the stairs that go down into the dark. The first warning begins with water, in a place where water should not be, which is under the ground. To the Sumerians, the world had a floor, and the floor was not the bottom of things. Beneath the dry land on which the cities stood, beneath the fields and the reed marshes and the foundations of the temples, they believed there was a vast body of sweet water, and they gave it a name. They called it the Abzu. In the later Babylonian form of the word, it becomes Apsu, and under either spelling it means the same thing. A great deep of fresh water lying underneath the solid earth, older than the earth, present before the world was arranged into its familiar shape. The Abzu was not the sea. The Salt Sea had its own name and its own character and its own divine person. Then the Abzu was the hidden water, the water below, the reservoir in the dark that fed the springs and the wells and the rivers that rose seemingly out of nothing in a land that was otherwise burning and dry. When a Sumerian drew clean water up out of a well, and it came up cold and sweet in the heat of the afternoon, that water came from the Abzu, and everyone knew it, and the knowing carried a weight of awe that we have almost entirely lost. The god of the Abzu was Enki. If you take only one name out of this entire documentary and carry it with you, make it that one, because Enki is the figure who stands at the center of nearly every strange thing the Sumerians ever wrote, and he is, crucially, the one who was on our side. In a pantheon full of beings who regarded the human race as an infestation, or a labor pool, or a mistake to be corrected, Enki is the exception, the god who argues for us, warns us, and repeatedly saves us against the wishes of his own kind. His name has been read to mean Lord of the Earth. A place called Eridu, that temple had a name too. They called it the Ebzu, which means the house of the Abzu, the house of the deep. The oldest sanctuary of the oldest city was built as a doorway to the water under the world. Now hold that image, because it is the first place where the canyon starts to answer back. The Grand Canyon is, before it is anything else, a story about water finding its way into stone and never leaving. A river cut it. The Colorado, brown with the ground-up bones of the continent, sawed down through layer after layer over a span of time the mind cannot hold, and what it exposed on the way down is a cross-section of the deep, a wall of the underneath laid open to the sun. And where the river runs today, at the very bottom, more than a mile below the rim, there is water in the dark, in a place where a person standing on the surface would swear there could be none. There are springs down there that come out of the solid rock, cold and sweet, fed by an aquifer no one has ever fully mapped, a hidden body of fresh water inside the plateau that the local peoples treated as sacred long before any government drew a boundary around it. The Havasupai, whose name means people of the blue-green water, have lived for centuries beside springs that pour turquoise out of the canyon wall for no reason anyone can see, water arriving from an unseen deep. If you wanted to build, on the actual surface of the earth, a working model of what the Sumerians meant by the Abzu, you could hardly do better than the bottom of the Grand Canyon. But the warning is not that the deep water exists, the warning is about what was done to it. Here the story turns dark, and it turns dark in a way that the mainstream translations report plainly and that few ever hear, because the plain report is stranger than any embellishment. In the great Babylonian poem we call the Enuma Elish, the poem that opens with the famous line about a time when the heavens above had not been named and the earth below had not been named, the Apsu is not merely a place. The Apsu is a person, a primordial being, the freshwater himself, mingled at the beginning with the salt water in a single undivided expanse. From that mingling, the first gods are born, and the first gods are loud. They are restless and boisterous, and they will not settle. And the old primordial Apsu, the deep, cannot rest for the noise of the young ones moving through him. So the deep decides to destroy his own children. He plans to kill them, to wipe them out, to return the world to the silence that came before them. And the god who stops him is Enki, in his Babylonian form Ea, the same god who will later stand between the human race and its own extermination. Ea learns of the plan. Ea works a spell, a deep sleep, and he pours that sleep over the primordial deep, and while the Apsu lies unconscious, Ea binds him and takes his crown and slays him. And then Ea does something that no summary of this story ever lingers on, though it is the hinge of everything that follows. Upon the body of the slain deep, upon the corpse of the Apsu, Ea builds his house. He establishes his dwelling on top of the thing he killed and sealed, and he names that dwelling the Apsu, and there, in a chamber built over a bound and murdered primordial power, his son is later conceived. Read that again slowly, because the shape of it is the shape of the whole warning. The deep is not empty, the deep is not inert. And the deep is a living power that once tried to destroy everything, that was put to sleep, bound, killed, and sealed. And over the seal a house was built, and the house was made to look ordinary, a dwelling like any other, so that the thing underneath it could be forgotten. That is the founding architecture of the Sumerian and Babylonian world. Not a floor of dead rock, a lid over something that has to stay down. The apologists for the purely literary reading will tell you this is metaphor, that the killing of the Apsu is a poetic way of describing the separation of fresh water from salt, the ordering of chaos into a habitable world, the victory of structure over the formless beginning. That reading is not wrong exactly. It is simply thin. It takes a story whose every detail insists on agency and intention and betrayal and burial, and it flattens all of that into a diagram about hydrology. And it cannot explain why the same motif, the same exact motif, keeps returning across the entire Sumerian corpus with the consistency of a thing remembered rather than the variety of a thing invented. Over and over the pattern repeats. There is a power in the deep. The power is dangerous. The power is bound and sealed. A structure is placed over the seal. And the maintenance of that seal is treated not as a myth to entertain children, but as an ongoing responsibility, a duty of the gods, and, through the gods, of kings, and through kings, of the whole ordered arrangement of civilization. The Sumerians did not think the deep had been dealt with once and forgotten. They thought it was being held, actively, continuously, the way a hand holds a door against a pressure on the other side. This is the first thing the Grand Canyon appears to know without being told. When those 19th century surveyors reached the bottom and looked up at the walls, they were looking at the inside of the lid. Every layer of that wall is a chapter of the deep brought into the light. And the deeper you go, the older and the stranger the rock becomes, until at the very bottom you reach the Vishnu schist, stone that is roughly 1.75 billion years old, stone that was already ancient before there was complex life anywhere on the planet, twisted and folded and shot through with veins of pale rock, where it was once melted and squeezed by forces that no longer operate at the surface of the world. The geologists who named it did not choose an American name or a scientific coinage. They reached across the entire planet and pulled out the name of a god, and not just any god. Vishnu, in the tradition they borrowed from, is the preserver, the one who sleeps upon the cosmic waters between the destructions of the world, the one whose waking and dreaming set the ages turning. They looked at the oldest stone in North America, the floor beneath the floor, and something in them said, correctly or not, that this was the resting place of a sleeping power on the water. They may have meant nothing by it. The pattern does not care what they meant. The pattern only notices that when human beings are confronted with the true bottom of the deep, they reach, again and again, across every barrier of language and culture and time, for the same handful of images. Water, sleep, a bound and ancient power. A seal that must be kept. There is a detail in the Eridu material that sharpens all of this to a point. Eridu, the city of Enki, the city of the Iabzu, the city built over the doorway to the deep, was regarded by the Sumerians as the very first city, the place where kingship first descended from heaven, the origin of ordered human life. And Eridu was built at the edge of a marsh, on the boundary between the dry land and the water, precisely at the seam where the surface world meets the world below. The Sumerians did not put their first and holiest city in the safest place they could find. They put it at the seam. They built their oldest temple as a hatch over the water under the world, and they treated the priest of that temple, the servant of Enki, as one of the most important men alive, because his job, in the deepest theological sense, was to keep the relationship between the two worlds in good order. He tended the seal. He kept the lid sitting right. And this is where the first warning finally speaks in its own voice, plainly, in the words the tablets actually use. Enki is called, among his many titles, the one who knows the Abzu, the one who knows the deep, not the one who owns it, not the one who conquered it, the one who knows it, the way a keeper knows the animal in the cage, the way an engineer knows the pressure in the pipe, with a knowledge that is inseparable from wariness. Enki is our friend among the gods precisely because he is the one who understands what is down there, and his friendship takes the form, more than once, of warning. He is the god who tips off the human survivor before the flood. He is the god who slips forbidden knowledge to the man Adapa. Yet he is the god who, again and again, comes to the edge of the deep and speaks up the stairs to us and tells us to be careful. The Abzu is his house, and he loves us, and even so, when he speaks of the deep, he speaks the way a man speaks of a fire he has banked for the night and does not fully trust to stay banked. So the first warning, stated as plainly as the material allows, is this. Beneath the solid ground, there is a deep of water and darkness that is older than the ordered world. Within that deep, something was bound and sealed at the very foundation of things, and a structure was built over the seal to hold it and to hide it. The keeping of that seal is not finished business. It is a live duty, and the friendliest power in the entire Sumerian heaven, the one God who has never once wished us harm, treats the deep with unbroken caution and returns to us over and over with the same message, which is that the door at the bottom is closed for a reason, and that we should be very slow to imagine we know better than the ones who closed it. Now carry that down the stairs, all the way to the bottom of the canyon, and stand on the Vishnu schist in the dark by the cold, sweet water, and ask yourself what the men who named this place were really naming. There is more to the Abzu than a bound power and a sealed lid, and the additional part is the part that turns a warning into a temptation. because the deep, in the Sumerian understanding, was not only dangerous, it was also the source. It was the place from which good things came, which is exactly why leaving it alone was so hard, and why the warnings had to be repeated so often. A thing that is purely a threat is easy to avoid. A thing that is a threat and a treasure in the same body is the thing that ruins people, because it dangles a reward in front of the danger, and the reward is real. The Sumerians believed that wisdom itself came up out of the Abzu. The deep was where Enki kept the sacred designs of civilization, the underlying plans and powers and offices that made ordered life possible. They had a word for these, a word that scholars usually leave untranslated because no single English term captures it, and the word was me. The me were something like the divine blueprints of reality, the decrees and functions and arts that, once granted, allowed a thing to exist as itself. There was a me of kingship and a me of priesthood, a me of truth and a me of falsehood, a me of the crafts, a me of music, a me of the descent into the underworld, and a me of the ascent back out of it. And these blueprints, these operating principles of the whole human world, were held in the Abzu, in the keeping of Enki, in the deep. Civilization, in other words, did not come down from the sky in the Sumerian scheme. It came up from below. It was drawn out of the sealed water like a bucket drawn from a well, and every good thing the human race possessed was, at bottom, a thing that had been brought up out of the place that also held the bound and murdered power that once tried to end the world. You cannot overstate how unstable that arrangement is, and the Sumerians clearly felt the instability, because their most famous story about the me is a story about theft and disaster. The goddess Inanna goes down to Enki in the Abzu, and he feasts her, and he drinks too much, and in his drunkenness he gives her the me, all of them, decree after decree, handing over the operating principles of civilization one after another until he has emptied the deep of its treasures into her boat. And when he sobers up and realizes what he has done, he panics, and he sends monsters after her to take it all back. And she flees across the water with the stolen blueprints of the world, and she wins, and she keeps them. The point of the story, for our purposes, is not who won. The point is the picture it paints of the deep as a vault that can be opened, drained, robbed, and emptied, and of the catastrophe that attends the opening. Even the good things in the Abzu are not safe to take. Even the treasures come with a curse of consequence attached. To reach into the deep, for any reason, even the best reason, is to risk letting out more than you meant to. Now, set that beside the newspaper story, because this is the point at which the Grand Canyon stops merely echoing the Sumerian pattern and starts, if the story is to be believed at all, to physically contain it. On the 5th of April in the year 1909, the Arizona Gazette, a real newspaper in Phoenix, ran a long article across its front page under a headline announcing explorations in the Grand Canyon and the discovery of a vast underground citadel. The article told the story of a man it called G.E. Kincaid, described as an explorer and archaeologist who claimed to have found, high in the sheer wall of a remote stretch of the canyon, the mouth of an artificial passage cut into the solid rock. He described following that passage back into the cliff and finding a mammoth chamber from which radiated a network of smaller rooms and corridors, like the spokes of a wheel, carved and finished by hands, running for what he estimated as miles into the plateau. And in those rooms, the article said, he found things that had no business being in North America. It described urns and vessels of copper and of an unknown gray metal. It described a great seated idol with the posture and the crossed legs of an Eastern god, but it described hieroglyphs cut into the stone. It described a chamber the article did not shy from calling a crypt, containing what were described as mummies, laid in tiers, wrapped and preserved, more than could easily be counted. The article attributed the excavation to the sponsorship of a major scientific institution and named a professor supposedly directing the work on site. Now, the responsible thing to say, and I will say it clearly because this documentary will not pretend the doubts do not exist, is that the mainstream verdict on this article is that it is a hoax, or at best, a piece of sensational newspaper fiction, of a kind that was common in that era, when frontier papers padded their pages with tall tales to sell copies. The institution named in the article has stated for decades that it has no record of the man, no record of the professor, and no record of any such excavation. No independent confirmation of the discovery has ever surfaced. No artifact from it has ever been produced. The names on the maps of the canyon, the Egyptian and Hindu temple names, were assigned by a geologist in the 1880s, who was drawing on world mythology as a deliberate naming theme for the many separate summits, not because anyone had found a temple. All of this is the sober counterweight, and it deserves to sit here in the open where you can weigh it. But weigh it honestly, and notice what it does and does not explain. It explains the article as a fabrication. It does not explain why the fabrication, if that is what it is, reads like a page torn out of the Sumerian understanding of the deep. Look at what the story claims to have found. A hidden passage into the wall of the deepest chasm on the continent. A great central chamber with corridors radiating out from it like spokes, which is the exact floor plan the Babylonians described for a sealed underground dwelling. Vessels of copper and of an unknown metal, the treasures of the vault. Hieroglyphs, a written record left in a place it was never meant to be read. A seated god in the posture of the east, in a canyon whose surveyed peaks already carry the names of eastern gods. And, at the heart of it, a crypt, a chamber of the preserved dead, laid in tears, and sealed away in the dark under the ground. Whoever wrote that article, hoaxer or witness, was describing an Abzu. They were describing a sealed deep that is also a vault of treasure and a house of the bound dead, a lid over the underneath with the wealth and the danger locked in together. Exactly the structure the first writers on Earth had described 4,000 years before, on clay, in a language that in 1909 had only recently been deciphered and was known to almost no one outside a handful of specialists. That is the thing the hoax theory has to swallow and cannot quite. To dismiss the article as a fabrication, you have to accept that a Phoenix newspaperman in 1909 independently reinvented the deep architecture of Sumerian and Babylonian cosmology, the central chamber, and the radiating corridors, and the vault of treasure, and the sealed crypt of the dead, and set it inside a canyon that other men, working separately, had already covered in the names of the old gods of that same cosmology. Coincidence is a real thing, and it happens more than people like to admit. But at some point, a pile of coincidences stops looking like chance and starts looking like a channel, a shape that the human imagination keeps flowing into whenever it turns toward the deep, because the shape was cut into us a very long time ago, and we have never entirely lost it. And there is the harder possibility, the one the second tradition will not let go of, which is simply that the article, in its bones, was describing something real, dressed up in the exaggerations of its day, and that the reason it matched the Sumerian pattern so precisely is that the Sumerian pattern was itself a report, and both accounts, the clay one and the newsprint one, were circling the same underlying fact. That the deep places of the world really do contain sealed structures, that those structures really are vaults and crypts together. Now that the reason the canyon carries the names of the old gods is that the men who named it were closer than we are to a memory that has since been buried, and that their hands move toward those names the way a hand moves toward a bruise, drawn to the sore spot without quite knowing why. You do not have to accept that possibility to feel its pull. You only have to stand at the rim and look down and understand that everything about the place is arranged like a warning that has been half forgotten. The oldest stone on the continent, named for the sleeping preserver on the cosmic waters. The temples of Isis and Osiris and Ra rising out of the haze, the deities of the Egyptian dead and their sealed tombs. Still the cold, sweet springs pouring out of the wall from an unmapped deep. A river, the color of ground bone at the bottom, sawing patiently downward through the layers of the lid. And a newspaper story, laughed off and never quite killed, that claims someone once found the door in the wall and went inside and saw the crypt. The first warning says the deep is real, the deep is bound, the deep is sealed, and the deep is both a treasure and a threat in the same body, so that the very thing that makes us want to open it is the thing that makes opening it catastrophic. Hold that, because everything that follows is a variation on it. Before we leave the first warning, there is a piece of physical evidence for how seriously these people took the sealed deep, and it is not a story, but an object, a thing they actually built and used, and it survived. In the great temples of Babylon, in the very sanctuaries where the priests carried out the daily service of the gods, there stood a basin, a large vessel of water, and that basin had a name, and the name was the Apsu. They built a model of the deep and set it inside the holiest room of the temple. The sealed water under the world, the domain of the bound power, was represented physically, in bronze and stone, filled with water, standing in the sanctuary as a permanent reminder that the temple itself sat over the deep, that the floor of the holy place was the lid of the abyss, that the relationship with the sealed water had to be tended every single day by human hands. Think about what it means to build that. These were not people who mentioned the deep in a myth and forgot about it. These were people who kept a scale model of the sealed abyss in their most sacred space and attended to it as part of the permanent ritual of holding the world together. The Apsu basin is the first warning turned into furniture, the sealed deep made into a fixture of daily religious life, because to the Sumerians and Babylonians, the maintenance of the seal was not a story about the past. It was a chore of the present, a duty that never ended, a lid that had to be watched. The Forbidden History reading takes all of this and pushes it one hard step further, and I want to lay that reading out plainly here, because it is the interpretation that gives this material its grip on the modern imagination. On that reading, Enki is not a god in the vague poetic sense at all. He is a specific being, one of the Anunnaki, the beings who came down, and his association with the deep water, with the Abzu, with the crafts and the secret knowledge, and the manufacture of the human worker, marks him as something like the chief scientist of the expedition, the engineer, the one who worked with the raw material of the planet and the raw material of life. The Abzu, on this reading, is not a mythological abstraction but a real place or a real kind of installation, a deep facility, a working of the underground, associated in the oldest texts, specifically with the extraction of what the tablets call the precious metal, with mining, with going down into the earth after something of value. And the sealing of the deep becomes, on this reading, the closing of a facility, the sealing of a working, the deliberate shutting of something that was once operational and is now shut down and hidden. I'm giving you this reading in its strong form, and I will tell you honestly that professional scholars of the ancient Near East reject it, that they regard the identification of the Anunnaki as flesh and blood visitors, and the reading of the Abzu as a mine or a facility as a distortion of the texts, driven by mistranslation and by a determination to find modern meanings in ancient poetry. That objection is serious, and it is not to be brushed aside. But hold the strong reading in your mind anyway, because the point of this documentary is not to tell you what to believe. It is to show you how precisely the oldest pattern fits, the strangest possibilities, and to let you feel the fit for yourself. And the fit, when you turn back to the canyon, is uncomfortably close. The Grand Canyon is riddled with caves. The great pale cliff band that runs through the middle of the canyon walls, the limestone that hikers know as the Red Wall, is shot through with caverns, hundreds of them, most never entered, many never even reached, openings in the rock high in the sheer faces where no person has ever set foot, a honeycomb of the deep hidden inside the walls of the chasm. This is not speculation, it is geology. Limestone dissolves in water, and where there is limestone and water and time, there are caves, and the canyon has all three in abundance. So its walls are perforated with hidden hollows that open into the dark of the plateau. Most of them will never be explored. Some of them, high in the unreachable cliffs, may never even be seen by human eyes. And it was in exactly such a place, a passage cut or found high in the sheer wall hundreds of feet above the river, unreachable by any ordinary means, that the old newspaper story placed its sealed city. The canyon really does contain hidden openings into the deep, in the walls, high up, out of reach, sealed by nothing more than their own inaccessibility. Whether any of them holds anything but darkness and stone, no one can say, because no one has been in most of them. The deep of the canyon is, in the most literal geological sense, full of sealed hollows that no one has opened. The first warning said the deep is full of sealed chambers that must be left closed. Then the canyon, without any help from mythology, simply is full of sealed chambers that no one has opened. Sometimes the pattern does not need interpretation. Sometimes it is just sitting there in the rock. There is a city that makes all of this concrete, and it is the oldest city the Sumerians knew, the one they themselves called the first city ever founded, the place where, in their own telling, kingship first came down from heaven and civilization began. Its name was Eridu, and it sat at the edge of the marshes near the Gulf, and its great temple was dedicated to Enki, and the name of that temple tells you everything. It was called the Abzu, which means the house of the Abzu, the house of the deep. They built the temple of the god of the deep, and they named it the house of the deep, and they raised it directly over the place where, in the sacred geography, the sealed abyss came nearest to the surface. And the archaeology of Eridu is genuinely remarkable, because when it was excavated, the diggers found not one temple, but a stack of them. Temple built upon temple, built upon temple, 18 levels of them, each new sanctuary raised directly on the ruins of the last, on exactly the same spot, for thousands of years, going down through the layers to the very oldest and simplest shrine at the bottom, a tiny room from the dawn of the settled world. For thousands of years, without interruption, on that one spot, they rebuilt the house of the deep, never moving it, never letting the site lapse, always raising the new sanctuary over the old on the same sacred ground. That is not ordinary piety. That is the behavior of a people who believed that a particular spot had to be kept covered, kept tended, kept crowned with a temple, generation after generation, because of what lay beneath it. The Abzu is the first warning made into a building and maintained for millennia, a house raised over the deep and rebuilt on itself 18 times, so that the covering of the sealed place would never fail. And the story of how the deep came to be sealed, in the great Babylonian creation epic, is not a gentle one, because the sealing was a killing. In the beginning, the epic says, there was only the mingling of the primeval waters, the fresh water and the salt, and the fresh water, the deep, the Abzu, was a person, a primordial being, and his name was Apsu. And the younger gods were born within him, and they were noisy, restless, full of motion, and their noise disturbed him, exactly as the noise of humanity would later disturb the gods and bring the flood. And Apsu, the deep, resolved to destroy his own children to have peace and silence again. But one of the young gods, the clever one, the god of wisdom who would become Enki, learned of the plan, and he struck first. He worked a spell that put the deep to sleep, and he killed Apsu, the primordial deep. And then, and this is the detail that binds the whole first warning together, he built his dwelling on top of the slain deep. He established his house upon the body of Apsu, made his home over the corpse of the sealed abyss, and it was there, over the killed and sealed deep, that the ordered world was founded and the god of wisdom took up his residence. The seal, in the oldest telling, is a tomb. The foundation of the ordered world is a body, the slain primordial deep, put to sleep and killed and built over, and the house of the god sits on top of it as a lid sits on a grave. This is why the deep is dangerous and why it must stay sealed. It is not empty. It is not merely deep, and it is the tomb of a slain primordial power, put down at the very beginning so that the ordered world could exist at all, and the whole architecture of civilization, in this vision, rests on the lid of that grave. Carry that back to the canyon and to the oldest stone at the bottom of it, the stone the geologists named for the god who sleeps on the cosmic waters between the destructions of the world, and feel how the name lands differently now. The deepest rock, the basement, the foundation on which the entire mile-high stack of the canyon's layers rests, named for a sleeping god on the waters, folded and dark and older than almost anything on the surface of the earth. The first warning says the foundation of the world is a sealed and sleeping deep, a slain primordial power put down and built over, and that everything we know rests on the lid of it. And at the bottom of the deepest canyon on the continent lies the oldest exposed stone on the continent, folded and black and named, by men who said they chose the name only for its grandeur, for a god who sleeps on the primordial waters between the drownings of the world. They built the layers of the canyon over that sleeping foundation as surely as Enki built his house over the slain deep, and the name they reached for, without knowing why, was the name of the sleeper on the waters at the bottom of everything. The Sumerians did not warn us once and move on. They warned us 7 times, from 7 directions, and the second direction is stranger than the first, because the second warning is not about the deep itself. It is about who came up out of it, and what they taught us, and why they were sent back down and shut away when the teaching was done. The second warning is about a debt, and about what the human race owes, and to whom, and about the strange conditions under which the debt was contracted, because the Sumerians did not believe that human beings had figured out civilization by themselves. They believed we were taught, directly, by beings who came up out of the deep water, and they were specific about how many of these beings there were. There were 7. The Sumerian word for them was Abgal, which the later Babylonians rendered as Apkallu, and the usual English translation is sage, though sage does not carry nearly enough weight for what these figures were. They were not wise men in the human sense. They were not philosophers or teachers of the ordinary kind. Yet they were beings sent up from the Abzu by Enki, from the sealed deep, to bring the arts of civilization to a human race that possessed none of them, and having delivered those arts, they went back down into the water from which they had come. 7 of them, one after another, in the age before the flood, each attached to one of the first cities and one of the first kings, each carrying up out of the deep another piece of the knowledge that turned scattered creatures into a civilization. Writing, law, the building of cities, the working of metal, but the reading of the sky, the rituals that held society together. All of it, the Sumerians said, came up out of the water in the hands of the 7, as a gift, or as a delivery, or as an installation, depending on how you want to read the tone of a story that is not entirely warm. We are not left to guess at what these beings looked like, because one of the most remarkable documents to survive from the ancient world describes them in detail, and it does not describe men. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, a Babylonian priest named Berossus, a keeper of the old temple traditions, wrote an account of his people's history in Greek, for the Greek-speaking world that had recently conquered his homeland. His original work is lost, but substantial pieces of it were quoted by later writers and survived through them, and among those surviving pieces is his account of the first sage, the being who began the whole transmission. Berossus calls him Oannes. And Berossus says, in language that has unsettled readers for 2,000 years, that Oannes came up out of the sea, out of the waters of the Gulf, and that his body was the body of a fish, and that beneath the fish head there was another head, a human head, and beneath the fish he had human feet, and that he had a human voice, and that he came up onto the land in the daytime and taught the people letters and mathematics and the founding of cities and the making of laws and the working of the ground, and gave them everything that softens and civilizes a life, and that when the sun went down he went back into the sea, because he was amphibious and lived in the water, and did not remain among human beings by night. And after him, Berossus says, others of the same kind appeared, up out of the same water, until the count was complete. Now, a person hearing that for the first time tends to file it immediately under fairy tale, the fishman who teaches the villagers, and that reflex is understandable, but before you file it, look at what actually survives on the walls. The Assyrians, who inherited the Sumerian and Babylonian traditions, carved the Apkallu into the stone of their palaces, over and over, as guardian figures, and we have those carvings. Some of them show a man wearing the skin of a great fish as a cloak, the fish head rising over the human head like a hood, the fish body hanging down the back, a costume that looks for all the world like a memory of Berossus's description translated into ritual dress, a priest dressed as the thing that came up out of the water. And others show something stranger, a figure with the body of a man and the head of a bird, a sharp curved beak, standing upright, carrying a bucket and a cone, performing some rite whose meaning we no longer fully understand. These bird-headed and fish-cloaked beings are among the most common protective images in the whole Assyrian world, set at doorways and thresholds, placed to guard the boundary between one space and another. The people who carved them were not illustrating a bedtime story. They were invoking a memory of the seven who came up out of the deep, and they placed that memory specifically at doorways, at the seams between inside and outside, at the guarded thresholds, which should already be making the back of your neck prickle if you have been following the pattern of the first warning. The Apkallu are tied, name by name, to the first kings and the first cities in a document scholars call the Uruk list of kings and sages, a tablet that pairs each of the antediluvian rulers with the sage who advised him. It reads like a ledger of the transmission, king and sage, down the line of the drowned cities, a bureaucratic record of exactly who taught whom, which is a very strange thing to have if the whole affair were merely a folk tale. Folk tales do not usually come with an administrative appendix. This one does. The Sumerians and their heirs kept the roster of the seven the way a guild keeps the roster of its masters, because to them, the transmission was not a myth. It was the founding fact of their civilization, the source of their legitimacy, the reason a king could claim to rule by more than force. He ruled because the knowledge in his city traced back, through a named sage, to the deep, to Enki, to the Abzu, to the source under the world. And here is where the warning turns, because a gift like that is never free, and the Sumerians knew it was never free, and the darkness in this story is in the fine print of the debt. The knowledge that came up out of the deep did not come up clean. It came up entangled with the deep itself, carrying the deep's character. And the deep, as the first warning established, is a bound and dangerous power that once tried to end the world. The Apkallu were not angels. They were emissaries from a domain that has to be kept sealed, and the tradition that surrounds them is shot through with unease about the very thing they gave us. There is a story, preserved in the Babylonian material, that one of the sages angered the gods, that the transmission was not a simple act of generosity but a thing that ran, at least once, out of control, that the deep gave more than it was supposed to give and had to be checked. And there is the larger, colder fact hanging over the whole roster, which is that the age of the seven sages is the age before the flood. The seven belong to the drowned world. Their transmission happened in the cities that the waters would later erase. And when the flood came and buried that first world, the age of the sages ended, and it did not resume. The beings who came up out of the deep to teach us did not keep coming. After the flood, the Sumerians say, there were no more Apkallu. There were only Umanu, human scholars, men who inherited fragments of the old knowledge and passed them along as best they could, a diminished thing, a copy of a copy, because the source had been cut off. The door in the water had been closed. Sit with that closure for a moment, because it is the heart of the second warning and it is easy to rush past. The knowledge that made us was withdrawn. The channel that carried it was shut. Whatever the seven were, whatever the deep is, the arrangement that once let wisdom flow up out of the sealed water into human hands was deliberately ended, and the ending was tied to the flood, to the Great Burial, to the drowning of the First World. The Sumerians did not present this as a tragedy exactly. They presented it as a correction. The flow had been too free. Too much had come up. The human race had received things it was perhaps not meant to keep. And after the flood, the tap was closed, and the difference between us and the deep was restored, the boundary re-established, the seven sent home, and the door shut behind them. This is a very particular kind of warning, and it is worth naming precisely what it warns against. It does not warn against knowledge in general. The Sumerians revered knowledge. It warns against knowledge from below, against the specific act of drawing wisdom up out of the sealed deep, against reopening a channel that was closed on purpose. It says that this has been tried before, that it worked for a while, that it gave us everything we have, and that it was shut down because it was dangerous, because what comes up out of the deep does not come up clean, because the source of the gift is also the home of the bound thing, and you cannot draw from the one without loosening the other. The seven sages are the friendliest face the deep ever showed us, emissaries of Enki himself, the god who loves us, and even they were sent back and sealed out. That is the measure of how careful the Sumerians thought we needed to be. Even the good things from below had to be locked away in the end. Now bring the canyon back into it, because the second warning has its own answer waiting at the bottom of the chasm. And the answer is the strangest object in the whole 1909 account. Among everything the article claimed had been found in the sealed chambers in the canyon wall, the detail that readers have fixated on for more than a century is the great seated figure. The article described a central chamber dominated by an idol, a large carved image of a being seated cross-legged, holding in each hand an object the writer compared to a lotus or a flower. With a countenance the article specifically compared to the images of the East, to the seated gods of Asia, to the posture we associate with the contemplative deities of the Old World. A seated teaching figure, hands raised or open, enthroned at the center of a sealed underground complex, in a canyon whose surveyed peaks the geologists had already named for Buddha and Brahma and Shiva and Osiris and Ra. Set that image beside the Apkallu and feel the two of them locked together. The seven sages were teaching figures, transmitters of civilization, emissaries from the deep, and they were remembered and carved and set at thresholds, precisely as seated or standing guardian figures, hands occupied with the instruments of their office, faces turned toward the ones they had come to instruct. The article claims that inside a sealed chamber in the deepest canyon on the continent, someone found exactly such a figure, a seated teaching god at the center of a network of rooms cut into the rock, guarded, hidden, and shut away. If the account is a hoax, then once again the hoaxer reached, without apparent knowledge of the cuneiform sources that were barely deciphered in his day, for the precise iconography of the sealed sage, the teaching being locked in the deep. And if the account is not entirely a hoax, then the implication is one that the second tradition finds almost impossible to look away from, which is that the withdrawal of the seven was not a metaphor and not a poem, that when the age of the sages ended, the sages did not simply vanish, that they were put somewhere, sealed somewhere, in the deep places of the world, in chambers cut into rock, behind doors, under the ground, and that one of those places might be a canyon in Arizona whose peaks a later generation of men would find themselves naming, without knowing why, for the gods of the sealed dead. Consider how strange it is that the canyon carries these names at all, and how the mainstream explanation, true as far as it goes, leaves a residue it cannot dissolve. A geologist in the 1880s looked at a landscape of separate summits and decided to name them for the deities of the world's great religions, and that is a documented fact, and it accounts for the names in the narrow sense of who wrote them down. But it does not account for the choice. Of all the naming themes a 19th century man of science might have reached for, he reached for the gods, and not the safe, familiar gods of his own culture, but the drowned gods, the buried gods, the deities of the Egyptian tombs and the Hindu cycles of destruction and renewal, the powers associated across a dozen traditions with death and the underworld and the sealed places below. He looked into the deepest hole in the continent, and his mind offered him Osiris, Lord of the Dead. It offered him Set, the god of the pit. It offered him Shiva, the destroyer and remaker of worlds. There is a temptation to call this nothing, a learned man's flourish, and maybe it is. But the second warning suggests another reading, which is that the deep imprints itself on the people who look into it, that a person standing at the edge of a sealed place feels the character of what is sealed even when he cannot name it, and reaches, half-consciously, for the words that fit the feeling. The names on the canyon may not be a record of what is down there. They may be a symptom of it. The second warning, then, gathered into a single statement, is this. The knowledge that built our civilization came up out of the sealed deep, carried by 7 beings who were emissaries of the one God who loves us. And even so, that channel was closed, deliberately, and the beings were sent back down and shut away, because what comes up from below always brings the deep along with it, and the human race had received more than it was meant to keep. Now, the warning is not only that the deep is dangerous, the warning is that the deep is generous, and that its generosity is the trap, and that the wise ones who understood the deep best chose, in the end, to seal even the gifts away rather than leave the channel open. When you stand at the rim and read the names of the sealed gods on the map, and when you read the old newspaper's account of a seated teaching figure locked in a chamber in the wall, you are looking at 2 versions of the same buried memory, the memory of the 7 who came up and were sent back and shut in the dark. And if the 7 were shut in, then something had to shut them in, and something had to hold the door. That is the 3rd warning. There is a ritual detail that makes the 2nd warning feel less like a legend and more like a memory that people were still trying to keep alive long after they understood it. Down through the centuries of Mesopotamian religion, priests performed rites, dressed in the skin of a great fish, the head of the fish rising over the head of the priest, the body of the fish hanging down the back like a cloak, and they did this in imitation of the Apkallu, in imitation of the fish sages who had come up out of the water to teach. Think about the strangeness of that. A living priest, centuries after the age of the sages was said to have ended, putting on the costume of the being that came up out of the deep, standing at the threshold, performing the rites of protection and purification, while dressed as the amphibious teacher from the sealed water. They were not illustrating a story, they were reenacting a contact. Still, they were keeping the memory of the 7 alive in their own bodies, wearing the shape of the thing that came up, as if the transmission itself had to be periodically renewed, as if the boundary between the human world and the deep had to be ritually crossed and recrossed by a man in a fish suit standing at the door. The whole apparatus of Mesopotamian temple ritual is shot through with this, with figures at thresholds, with the fish cloaked and the bird-headed guardians set at every doorway, with the constant ceremonial acknowledgement that the important boundaries are guarded and that the guardians are the 7 who came up out of the deep. A culture does not build that much ritual around a bedtime story. It builds it around something it believes actually happened, and fears might happen again, and feels the need to manage forever. The forbidden history reading of the 7 sages is, at this point, almost too obvious to need stating, but I will state it because the mainstream response to it matters. On the bold reading, the Apkallu were exactly what Berossus said they were, beings who came from outside, who were not human, who possessed knowledge the human race did not have and could not have developed on its own, who delivered that knowledge in a compressed burst at the very beginning of civilization and then departed, and whose departure was remembered as a return to the water, a going back down into the deep. The sudden appearance of Sumer on this reading, the way civilization seems to switch on all at once in southern Iraq with writing and mathematics and astronomy and law arriving almost fully formed, is precisely what you would expect if a teaching had been delivered rather than developed, installed rather than discovered. And the withdrawal of the sages, the end of the age of the Apkallu, is the departure of the teachers, the closing of the contact, the sealing of the channel. The mainstream reply is firm and deserves its hearing. Berossus wrote in the 3rd century before the Common Era, more than 2,000 years after the events he describes, in a Hellenistic world hungry for exotic Eastern wisdom, and his fishman is best understood as a symbol, the personification of civilization arriving from the direction of the sea, from the trading cultures of the Gulf, a poetic compression of a long and ordinary process of cultural development into a single memorable figure. The rapid rise of Sumer, on the mainstream view, is rapid only by the standards of a casual glance, and rests on thousands of years of gradual agricultural and social development that the archaeology documents in detail. Both of these things can be held at once. The mainstream account is sober and well-founded, and the pattern it explains keeps, even so, arranging itself into the shape of a delivered gift and a sealed departure over and over in the texts and in the rituals and in the costumes the priests put on to remember it. Now hold the seated god in the canyon wall one more time, and hold it beside the 7, and notice the number, because the number is not nothing. The forbidden forest had its guardian. The gate of the sun had its guardians. And the teaching came from 7 sages, 7 cities, 7 kings. The number pressed again and again into the foundation of the Sumerian world, the 7 who came up and the 7 who were sent back. This documentary is built around 7 warnings, not because 7 is a convenient number for a video, but because 7 is the number the Sumerians themselves reached for whenever they described the architecture of the sealed deep. The 7 sages, the 7 gates of the underworld that the last warning will bring us to, the sevenfold structure of the descent and the seal. The seated figure the old newspaper placed at the heart of the canyon complex sat, the article said, at the center of a network of chambers radiating outward like spokes, and one wonders, reading it now with the 7 in mind, how many spokes there were, how many chambers, how many sealed rooms around the central teaching god. Because if the answer were 7, the pattern would close with a click that would be very hard to explain as coincidence. We will never know, because no artifact from that complex has ever been produced, and the whole account may be a fabrication from beginning to end. But the mind that reads the 7 sages and then reads the old article cannot help arranging the chambers around the seated god and counting, and finding that the shape it wants to make is a shape the Sumerians made first, 4,000 years ago, in the oldest words we can still read. The tradition did not leave the 7 sages as a vague and faceless group. It named them, and it paired them, one by one, with the kings of the antediluvian cities, so that the transmission of knowledge is laid out as a precise correspondence, a sage for each throne, the wisdom of the deep matched to the power of the crown. A tablet from the city of Uruk, written late but drawing on far older material, sets it out almost like a ledger, this king in this city, and beside him this sage, and beside the next king, the next sage, all the way down the line of the first world. The first and greatest of them, the sage of the first king in the first city, bore a name the tradition also attached to the first man to receive wisdom directly, the one brought to the very threshold of the knowledge of the gods. The others carried their own names, strange and specific, and the tradition said of them together that they were the ones who perfected the plans of heaven and earth, who laid down the foundations, who established the correct order of the temples and the rites and the crafts, the whole apparatus of civilization delivered as a finished design by 7 beings who came up out of the deep and stood beside the first kings and taught. This is not the picture of a civilization slowly figuring things out. It is the picture of a civilization installed, the plans handed over complete, by teachers from below, each assigned to a throne, the knowledge distributed across the 7 cities of the first world in an orderly transmission that the tradition remembered in detail and set down as history. And the tradition was honest about something else, something darker, which is that the coming of the sages was not remembered as purely a blessing. Later texts carry a strange ambivalence about the Apkallu, hints that some of them overstepped, that the knowledge they brought was double-edged, that there were sages associated with transgression, with angering the gods, with a wisdom that reached too far. In some tellings, it is precisely the accumulation of the sages' knowledge in the hands of humanity that helps bring on the crisis that ends in the flood, the first world growing too clever, too full of a borrowed wisdom it had not earned and could not properly bear, until the ones above decided the experiment had to be ended. The gift and the catastrophe are linked. The sages give the knowledge swells the first world past its safe limits, and the flood comes down, which means the second warning and the fourth are 2 halves of one story. The knowledge comes up out of the deep in the hands of the 7, and when it has done its work of making the first world too, knowing, the flood buries that world and the sages are withdrawn, sent back down, the channel closed. The gift is given once, in full, and then the door in the water is shut, and it is never opened again in the same way. Because the tradition understood that a gift like that can only be given once, and that what it grows into has to be drowned before it grows too far. That is why the second warning insists so hard on the withdrawal, on the one-way nature of the transmission. After the flood, the texts are clear. There were no more true Apkallu of the old kind. There were, at most, beings of partly human descent who carried a diminished portion of the old wisdom. And then only human scholars, the Umanu, learned men who preserved and copied and interpreted what had been handed down but who could not add to it, could not go back to the source, because the source was sealed. The knowledge of the first world was a closed canon, received once from the deep and thereafter only guarded, never renewed. And when you carry that back to the canyon and to the seated teaching figure the old story placed at the heart of the sealed complex, the shape of the thing sharpens. A teacher, seated, at the center, in a sealed place, surrounded by the records of a knowledge that was delivered and then closed off, a vault not of treasure but of a transmission that could never be repeated, sealed precisely because it was finished, because the door in the water had shut and would not open again. Whether or not that chamber ever existed, it is the exact architectural expression of what the second warning describes, a knowledge given once by teachers from the deep and then sealed away when the teaching was done and the teachers were withdrawn. Because the Sumerians did not only tell us that the deep is sealed and that its gifts are dangerous. They told us that the seal has a guardian, and they told us what happened to the one hero who was bold enough and foolish enough to go up to a guarded gate in the deep places of the world and force it open. The third warning is the one the Sumerians and their heirs told most often, and told with the most feeling, because it is the one that comes with a hero attached, and heroes are how a culture teaches a lesson it wants remembered. The lesson is simple and it is brutal. There is a gate in the deep places of the world. The gate has a guardian. The guardian is there on purpose, set by the gods to keep the gate shut. And the greatest hero who ever lived went up to that gate and forced it open and killed the guardian and took what was inside, and it destroyed the person he loved most in the world, and it broke him, and he spent the rest of his life trying and failing to undo it. The story is the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest long poem in human history, and at its center is a warning about opening a guarded door that you were told to leave alone. Gilgamesh was a king of Uruk, and the poem treats him as a real king, a historical figure inflated to legend, 2/3 god and 1/3 man, strong beyond any mortal and restless beyond any peace. And into his life comes Enkidu, a wild man shaped from clay and set loose in the wilderness, who becomes, after a great wrestling match that neither can win, the friend and equal that Gilgamesh has never had. The two of them together are unstoppable, and being unstoppable and young and full of the hunger for a name that will outlast them, they go looking for something enormous to do. What they choose is the cedar forest. The cedar forest, in the geography of the poem, is a far and sacred place, a mountain of towering trees, and it is not open. It is forbidden. It belongs to the gods, and it is guarded, and its guardian is a being named Humbaba, whom the god Enlil himself appointed to keep the forest and to terrify anyone who approached it. Humbaba is described in terms meant to freeze the blood, his voice a flood, his mouth fire, his breath death, his face a coil of intestines like a maze with no way out. He is not a monster in the sense of a beast to be hunted for sport. He is a keeper. Then he is the thing set at the threshold to make sure the threshold stays uncrossed. And here is the detail that matters most for the third warning, the detail that the adventure story wrapping usually hides. Humbaba is doing his job. He is not marauding. He is not attacking the cities of men. And he is sitting in the forbidden forest that he was assigned to guard, keeping the gate the way he was told to keep it, and the heroes go to him. They cross a great distance specifically in order to reach the guarded place and force their way in. When they arrive at the edge of the forest, they find a gate, and the poem lingers on this gate, a tall and beautiful and terrible gate at the boundary of the sacred wood, and Enkidu puts his hand to it, and the gate injures him, and there is a moment, a real moment in the oldest story we have, where the wild man looks at his wounded hand and feels the first cold breath of doubt, the sense that they have come to a place they should not have come to, that the gate itself is warning them. He says as much. He tells Gilgamesh that his strength has left him, that his arm has gone weak, that something about this threshold is wrong, and Gilgamesh, being Gilgamesh, talks him back into it. They go in. They confront the guardian, and when they have Humbaba beaten and at their mercy, the guardian does the thing that guardians do in these stories, the thing that should stop the hero cold and never does. He begs. He offers to serve, and more than that, he warns them. Humbaba tells them plainly that killing him will bring down consequences they cannot imagine, that he is the servant of Enlil, that his death will not go unanswered, that they are about to break something that cannot be put back. They kill him anyway. They cut off his head. Yet they cut down the great cedars, including the tallest and most sacred, and they make of it a gate to carry back to their city as a trophy, turning the guardian's forest into a door of their own, which is a detail so loaded that the poem clearly means us to feel its weight. And then the price comes due, exactly as the guardian promised, and it comes due in the cruelest possible way, which is that it does not fall on Gilgamesh. It falls on Enkidu. The gods convene, and they judge that the killing of Humbaba and the felling of the sacred cedars cannot go unpunished, and they decree that one of the two friends must die, and they choose Enkidu. He does not die in battle. He is not granted a clean warrior's end, but he sickens. He lies down, and he wastes away over long days, cursing and afraid, describing to Gilgamesh the grim house of dust he can already feel pulling him down, the place under the ground where the dead sit in darkness with feathers for clothing and clay for bread. And Gilgamesh, who has never lost anything, watches his friend die slowly of a wound that has no visible cause, a wound that is really the delayed recoil of a gate they were told not to open, and it destroys him. The second half of the epic is nothing but the long unraveling of a man who forced a guarded door and is now paying for it forever, who cannot accept the death he caused, who runs to the ends of the earth looking for a way to escape the consequence and never finds one. That is the third warning in its plainest form. The gate is guarded. The guardian will warn you. Opening it anyway will cost you the thing you can least afford to lose, and the cost will come sideways, on a delay, falling not where you brace for it, but where you are soft. And no strength, no matter how great, no cleverness, no matter how sharp, will let you take it back once it is done. The same epic gives us a second guarded gate, and this one sits even closer to the deep, because it is the gate that leads to the very edge of the mortal world and beyond it. After Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh, terrified now of his own death, sets out to find the one man who ever escaped it, the survivor of the Great Flood, who lives far away at the source of the rivers and holds the secret of eternal life. And to reach him, Gilgamesh has to pass through a mountain called Mashu, a mountain whose twin peaks hold up the sky and reach down to the underworld, the mountain through whose gate the sun goes down at evening and comes up at dawn. It is, in other words, a boundary between the world we know and the world below, a hinge between the surface and the deep, and that gate too is guarded. It is guarded by beings the poem calls the Scorpion people, a man and a woman, whose terror is described as overwhelming, whose gaze is death, who keep the pass where the sun travels. When Gilgamesh approaches, they challenge him. They tell him that no mortal has ever passed this way, that the road beyond the gate is the road the sun takes through total darkness, 12 leagues of blackness with no light at all, and that a living man cannot walk it. They are, once again, doing their job. Now they are keeping a threshold that mortals are not meant to cross. The difference this time is instructive, and it is the reason the second gate matters as much as the first. Gilgamesh does not kill the Scorpion Guardians. He has already paid the price for forcing one guarded gate, and he is a changed man, humbled and frightened and grieving. And when the Guardians see who he is, and hear why he has come, they let him through. They warn him of the darkness ahead, and they open the gate, and he passes. And notice what lies beyond it. Not a treasure, not a prize. 12 leagues of absolute darkness that he must run through in a race against the rising sun. And at the end of it, a strange garden and the long road to a survivor who will tell him, in the end, that the thing he seeks does not exist for him, that he will die like every other man, that the door he is trying to open, the door out of death, has no key. The second gate teaches the counter lesson to the first. The first gate, forced, destroys you. Still, the second gate, approached with fear and grief and respect, opens. And what lies beyond it is not a reward, but a hard truth and a long darkness. Either way, the message about the guarded threshold is the same. It is guarded because the passage is real and dangerous and not meant for us, and the beings at the gate are not obstacles to be beaten, they are keepers to be reckoned with. Now think about what these two gates have in common, because the common features are precisely the features that the whole Sumerian tradition attaches to the sealed deep. Both gates stand at a boundary between the surface world and something below or beyond. Both are guarded by beings whose entire purpose is to keep the threshold uncrossed. Then both guardians warn the traveler explicitly. And in both cases, the thing on the other side is bound up with the deep, with the underworld, with the path of the sun through the darkness under the earth, with the buried survivor of the drowned world. The Sumerians placed guardians at the thresholds of the deep as a matter of cosmic architecture. The Apkallu, remember, the 7 sages from the Abzu, were carved by the Assyrians and set at doorways precisely as guardian figures, fish-cloaked and bird-headed, positioned at the seams between spaces. And the whole imaginative world of these people is organized around the idea that the important boundaries are guarded, that where there is a passage to the deep, there is a keeper standing at it, and that the keeper is there for our protection as much as for the protection of what lies below. And so we come back to the wall of the canyon, and to the one detail in the 1909 account that I have been holding in reserve for exactly this moment. The article does not describe an open cave. It describes a passage cut into the sheer face of the cliff, hundreds of feet above the river, in a place almost impossible to reach. And it describes that passage as having, at its mouth and along its length, the marks of deliberate closure. The explorer is said to have found the entrance and to have made his way in, but the account carries throughout it the sense of a place that had been sealed, a place that was not meant to be entered, a door in the rock high in an unreachable wall. Whether or not a single word of that article is true, the image it plants is the image of the third warning made physical. A guarded, sealed threshold in the deep places of the world, cut into stone, placed where no ordinary person could ever stumble upon it, closed on purpose against exactly the sort of bold and restless explorer who would try to force it open. There is a sober, verifiable fact that sits underneath the sensational story and gives it an uncomfortable edge. Large stretches of the Grand Canyon, including some of the very areas that carry those loaded mythological names, are genuinely off-limits to the public. This is real, and it has ordinary explanations that I will not pretend away. Some of it is the protection of fragile archaeology, the pueblos and granaries and sacred sites of the peoples who have lived in and around the canyon for thousands of years, sites that would be destroyed by casual traffic. Some of it is simple deadly danger, sheer walls and flash floods in terrain that kills the unprepared with great regularity. Yet some of it is the sovereignty and the sacred privacy of the tribes whose land borders and overlaps the canyon and whose wishes deserve respect. These are good reasons, real reasons, and I am not going to insult you by pretending the restrictions are all sinister, but hold the pattern in your mind anyway. The oldest stories the human race ever wrote down insist that the passages to the deep are guarded and closed and forbidden, kept shut by keepers set there for the purpose, and that forcing them open brings a delayed and terrible price. And in the deepest canyon on the continent, whose peaks bear the names of the drowned gods, there are passages and heights that ordinary people are, in plain fact, kept out of. The reasons given are earthly. The pattern is older than Earth. But the third warning then, gathered up, is this. Every passage to the deep is guarded, and the guardian is not your enemy but your last warning. And the guardian will tell you, in words, that opening the gate carries a price. The greatest hero who ever lived heard that warning at the gate of the forbidden forest and ignored it, and it cost him the one person he loved, on a delay, sideways, in the soft place, and no power on earth let him take it back. The same hero, humbled, came to a second gate that led toward the deep and did not force it but approached it with dread, and it opened. And beyond it was only darkness and a hard truth. Now the gate is real. The guardian is real. The price is real. And when you stand before a sealed passage in the wall of the deepest place on the continent, the correct feeling is not curiosity. It is the cold prickle that Enkidu felt when he laid his hand on the gate of the forest and his strength ran out of him, the body's older wisdom telling the mind that some doors are shut because of what is on the other side. There is a quality the guardians share that deserves a closer look, because it recurs across the whole tradition, and it is genuinely strange, and it is the terror they radiate, described in the text not as a matter of size or teeth, but as a kind of emanation, an aura, a radiance that overwhelms anyone who comes near. Humbaba is wrapped in it. He wears, the poem says, 7 layers of a terrifying radiance, 7 auras of dread, and to approach the forbidden forest is to be stripped of will and strength by this emanation before a single blow is struck. The Sumerians and Babylonians had a specific word for this quality, a word scholars usually render as an awe-inspiring radiance, a divine terror that clung to gods and to sacred objects and to the guardians of forbidden places, and it was understood as something almost physical, a force that pressed on the mind and the body of anyone who entered its range. Notice again the number. 7 layers of radiance around the guardia of the forbidden place, the same 7 that will lock the gates of the underworld in the final warning. And notice that the terror is described as a barrier in its own right, an invisible field of dread around the guarded thing, a warning you feel in your body before you ever see the guardian, exactly the cold prickle that ran through Enkidu and drained the strength from his arm when he laid his hand on the gate. The guardians of the deep, in the oldest telling, do not only stand in the way, they broadcast. They fill the approach to the forbidden place with a dread that is meant to turn you back before you arrive. The forbidden history reading seizes on this, and I give it to you as interpretation and not as fact. On that reading, the radiance of the guardian, the field of dread around the forbidden place, the emanation that strips the will and the strength from anyone who enters its range, is not poetry at all, but a description, in the only language the ancient witness had available, of something we would recognize, an actual force, an actual field, a defense around a sealed installation that acts on the body and the mind of the intruder. The guardian who cannot be approached because of the terror he radiates becomes, on this reading, an automated defense, a thing that projects a field, and the sacred forbidden forest becomes a restricted zone, protected by a technology remembered as a monster because a monster was the only shape the memory could take. I will be careful and fair here. This is a leap, and the mainstream reads the radiance of Humbaba as exactly what it appears to be in the poem, the awe and dread that ancient people attach to the divine and the forbidden, a literary and religious motif with no need of technology to explain it, and that reading is entirely sufficient and probably correct. But sit with the strong version for a moment, because it changes how you hear the next detail, which is what the heroes did to the guardian's forest after they killed him. They cut it down. They felled the sacred cedars, and out of the tallest and most forbidden tree, the very heart of the guarded place, they built a gate, an enormous door, and they floated it down the river to carry home to their city as a trophy. Still, they turned the forbidden zone into a door of their own. They took the material of the sealed place and made it into a threshold, which is either a poet's dark irony or a memory of something looted from a guarded installation and repurposed by the ones who forced it open. Either way, the poem clearly means us to feel the transgression of it, the wrongness of taking the guarded thing and making it into a door you can walk through whenever you like. And that brings the third warning home to the canyon with a particular force, because the canyon's guardians, in plain, unmysterious fact, are its inaccessibility and its danger, and those are guardians that have turned many bold people back and killed a good number of them. The stretches of the canyon that carry the loaded names, the remote temples, and the sealed high caves are protected by walls that cannot be climbed, by heat that kills, by floods that come without warning down the side canyons and drown the unprepared in minutes, by distances that break the strong. People die in the Grand Canyon every year, and they die most often precisely when they push past the marked and the permitted into the remote and the forbidden, drawn by exactly the restless boldness that took Gilgamesh to the forbidden forest. The canyon does not need a monster wrapped in 7 auras of dread. It has the auras built in, the field of danger around the deep places that presses on the body of anyone who approaches, and that has turned back or destroyed nearly everyone who ever tried to reach the sealed heights. And laid over that natural guardianship there is the humankind, the rules and the boundaries and the closed areas, backed by earthly reasons that are real and sufficient, the protection of heritage and the protection of life and the respect owed to the tribes. The third warning says the deep is guarded, and the guardian is your last warning, and forcing the gate carries a price paid sideways and past all recovery. The canyon says the same thing, in the language of sheer rock and killing heat and sudden water, a guarded place that broadcasts its danger to the body of anyone who comes near, and that exacts its price, every single year, from those who ignore the warning and push past the gate. And there is a second guarded gate in the same epic, later in the hero's road, that deserves its own moment, because it is even closer to the shape of the canyon than the forbidden forest was. After Gilgamesh loses his friend and sets out, half mad with the fear of his own death, to find the one man who survived the flood and won eternal life, his road brings him to a mountain, and the mountain has a name, and the name is Mashu, which means something like twins, because it is a great twin-peaked mountain whose 2 summits hold up the sky and whose roots go down to the underworld. And in the face of that mountain there is a gate, and the gate is the passage of the sun, the tunnel through which the sun travels down into the earth at evening and through the dark under the mountain to rise again at dawn. And the gate is guarded. The guardians are beings the poem calls scorpion men, creatures so terrible that their aura is death, whose glance withers, who stand watch over the rising and the setting of the sun, over the threshold between the lit world and the dark passage under the earth. Gilgamesh comes to them, and even he, who killed the guardian of the cedar forest, is struck with terror at the sight of them and covers his face. And he begs them for passage, and they warn him. They tell him that no one has ever made the journey he intends, that the way through the mountain is the road the sun travels, that it is total darkness the whole way, a tunnel of perfect blackness that takes 12 hours to cross, with no light at all, and that no mortal has ever entered it and come out the other side. They warn him. And then, because he will not be turned back, they let him go. And he enters the mountain, and he runs through the absolute dark, hour after hour, in a blackness so complete that the poem lingers on it, no light ahead and no light behind, the terror of the buried dark pressing on him from every side, until at the last possible moment he bursts out into the light of a garden on the far side. The guarded gate here is a tunnel through a mountain, the road of the sun, watched by guardians of lethal aura, opening into total darkness. And it is the threshold between the world of the living and the far country where the survivor of the flood lives beyond the reach of death. Now hold that beside the canyon, because the fit is almost too neat to say out loud. The canyon runs, in its great central length, close to east and west, the road of the sun, and the sun pours down its length at the day's beginning and the day's end, and the river at the bottom runs through the rock like the tunnel through Mashu, a passage cut down into the deep earth, walled in stone, that the light enters and leaves. To stand in the inner gorge at the bottom of the canyon, in the narrow dark between the walls of the oldest stone, is to stand in something very like the tunnel of the sun, a passage through the mountain, walled in the ancient rock, where the light comes and goes and the dark presses close. The people who named the canyon's summits for the gods of the dead were naming a place that already had the shape of the Mashu gate built into it by the river and the sun, a twin-walled passage through the deep earth, a road of light through a tunnel of stone, guarded now, as it was guarded then, by the lethal aura of the place itself, the heat and the fall and the flood, that strikes the unprepared with a terror the scorpion men would have recognized. The third warning gave us the guardian and the price. Then the gate of Mashu gives us the shape of the door, a tunnel through the mountain on the road of the sun, watched by guardians of killing aura, opening from the world of the living into the deep dark and the far country of the dead. And it is a shape the canyon wears in its own stone, a mile down, where the river runs east and west through the black passage of the inner gorge, and the light comes and goes over the oldest rock on the continent. Which raises the question the fourth warning finally answers. The question that has been building under everything so far. What is on the other side? What exactly did the gods seal into the deep and set guardians over and close against us with such care? The Sumerians told us. And their answer is bound up with the flood, with the great drowning, with the burial of the first world. Because the fourth warning proposes something that turns the whole familiar story of the flood inside out. It proposes that the flood was not a disaster at all. It proposes that the flood was a method. The fourth warning asks you to look at the most familiar story in the world and see it upside down, and once you have seen it that way, you will not be able to unsee it. The story is the flood. Almost everyone alive has met some version of it. The rising waters, the chosen survivor, the boat full of life, the bird sent out to find dry land, the covenant afterward. It reaches nearly everyone through the account in the book of Genesis, and in that account, the flood has a clear moral shape. The world has become wicked. God is grieved by the wickedness. The flood is a punishment and a cleansing, a terrible justice, and the survivor is a righteous man spared because he alone walked with God. It is a hard story, but a comprehensible one. There is sin, and there is judgment, and there is mercy for the deserving. That is the version we inherit. But that version is not the oldest one. The oldest one is Sumerian and Babylonian, written down more than 1,000 years before the Hebrew account took its final form. And in the oldest version, the moral shape is simply gone. There is no wickedness, there is no sin, and there is no righteous man spared for his virtue. In the oldest telling, the flood is sent for a reason so cold, so far outside our categories of justice, that translators when they first read it clearly did not know what to do with it. The best preserved version is a Babylonian epic called Atrahasis, named for its human hero, and it lays the whole grim machinery out in order, and the machinery has nothing to do with morality at all. It begins, Atrahasis tells us, with labor. In the time before human beings existed, the work of the world was done by the lesser gods, the ones the Sumerians called the Igigi, who dug the rivers and carried the baskets of earth and maintained the whole physical estate of the greater gods. And they did this for ages until they could bear it no longer. And they rose up in something very like a labor revolt, and they surrounded the house of the chief god and threw down their tools and refused to dig another canal. And to solve the crisis, to end the strike, Enki proposed the creation of a substitute worker, a new creature to bear the load the lesser gods refused to bear any longer. That creature was us. Humanity, in the oldest account of our own origin that exists, was manufactured to be a labor force, made from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, designed and mass-produced for the specific purpose of doing the work the gods no longer wanted to do. We were not the crown of creation. We were the solution to a staffing problem. And we worked. And here is where the horror begins, quietly, in a detail that is easy to skate over. We multiplied. The account says the human race increased, spread over the land, became numerous, and became loud. The word that recurs is noise, the clamor of humankind, the din of a growing population, and this noise reaches the chief god Enlil and it disturbs his rest. He cannot sleep for the racket of the creatures that were made to serve him. That is the whole of the grievance, not sin, not wickedness, noise, numbers, the mere overwhelming presence of too many of us, too loud, too many, keeping the master awake. And Enlil's solution to the noise is not correction and not instruction. It is reduction. He decides to cull the herd. He does it in stages, and the staged cruelty of it is one of the most chilling things in all of ancient literature, because it reads like a series of population control measures escalating toward a final solution. First, Enlil sends a plague, a wasting sickness to thin the numbers. And each time, the human race is saved by the same figure, our friend in the deep, Enki, who cannot bear to watch and who tips off his favorite among the humans, the wise man Atrahasis, telling him how to avert the disaster, how to redirect the people's worship so the plague is lifted. When the plague fails to reduce us enough, Enlil sends drought, and the rains stop and the fields crack, and the people begin to starve, and again Enki intervenes, and again the human race survives. Enlil sends famine, harsher, more total, and describes it in terms that are genuinely difficult to read, the land turning white with salt, the wombs of women closed, the food gone, and still, through Enki's help, we endure. And Enlil, thwarted again and again, enraged that his cull keeps failing because one of his own kind keeps warning the cattle, resolves at last on the method that cannot be survived. He will drown the world. He will send a flood to wipe the human race off the face of the earth entirely and be done with the noise forever. And this time he makes the other gods swear an oath. This time Enki is bound by his word not to warn the humans. The extermination is to be total, and it is to be secret, and the one god who might save us has been sworn to silence. What Enki does next is the hinge of the fourth warning, and it is a small masterpiece of loophole, and it tells you everything about the character of the deep and the character of the one who keeps us. Enki has sworn not to warn the human being, so he does not warn the human being. Instead, he goes to the wall of the reed hut where Atrahasis is sleeping, and he speaks to the wall. He addresses the reed fence, the wall of the house, and he tells the wall, in a loud voice, to tear down the house and build a boat, to abandon possessions and save life, to take the seed of all living things aboard a vessel sealed with pitch, because a flood is coming to end the world. He speaks to the wall, and the man on the other side of the wall overhears, which is exactly what Enki intended, and by this thin technicality, the survivor is warned without the letter of the oath being broken. The flood comes. It is so terrible that the poem says even the gods were frightened of it, that they fled up to the highest heaven and cowered there like dogs against a wall, that the goddess who had helped make humanity wailed and regretted what they had done as she watched her children fill the sea like dead fish. The waters cover everything. The first world, the world of the seven sages and the antediluvian kings, and the cities where kingship first came down from heaven, is drowned entirely and buried under the water, and when the water finally recedes, that world is gone, erased, sealed under the mud. Now stop, and look at what the flood actually accomplished in this telling, stripped of the moral gloss that later traditions painted over it. The flood did not cleanse a wicked world. There was no wickedness. The flood erased a world that had become too knowledgeable, too numerous, too aware, too loud. It was a reset. It was a deliberate act of burial, engineered by the ruling power, specifically to make the old arrangement go away, to put the first world under the ground and start over with whatever survived, and the whole thing was meant to be total and secret, an extermination that would leave no witness and no record. That is the fourth warning in its raw form. The Great Flood was not a natural catastrophe and not a divine justice. It was a method. It was the tool by which the deep swallowed the first world on purpose, and the reason we know about the first world at all is that the method failed at exactly one point, that one god broke ranks and spoke to a wall, and a single thread of the drowned world was pulled up out of the water before it sank forever. And that single surviving thread carried something with it. And this is the detail that binds the fourth warning to the canyon and to everything this documentary is about, because the survivor did not only save living things. In the account preserved by the Babylonian priest Berossus, the same priest who told us about the fish sage Oannes, the god who warns the flood hero, gives him one additional instruction before the waters come. An instruction that has nothing to do with the boat. He tells him to take the writings, the records, the accumulated knowledge of the world that is about to be destroyed, and to bury them. Specifically, Berossus says, the survivor was told to bury the tablets, the beginnings and middles and ends of all learning, in the city of the sun, in Sippar, before the flood, so that after the waters receded, the knowledge could be dug back up, and the human race would not have to begin again from nothing. And after the flood, Berossus says, the survivors were told to go to Sippar and to dig up the buried writings and to recover what had been sealed underground against the drowning of the world. Read that and let it settle. The oldest flood tradition on Earth does not only describe a great burial, it describes a deliberate act of sealing knowledge underground to survive the burial. A vault of tablets hidden in the earth before the catastrophe so that it could be recovered after. A time capsule against the reset, placed by the friendly god's instruction, in the ground, sealed, waiting. That is the shape the fourth warning has been building toward, and it is the shape that makes the canyon impossible to look away from. The Sumerian tradition contains, at its very foundation, the idea that the deep can be used to bury a world, that this has been done before, on purpose, and that when it was done, knowledge was sealed underground to outlast the burial. Sealed chambers, buried records. A vault in the earth holding the learning of a drowned age. This is not a modern fantasy laid over the ancient texts. It is in the ancient texts. It is what Berossus wrote down from the temple traditions of Babylon more than 2,000 years ago. Now walk to the rim of the Grand Canyon and look at what a flood actually leaves behind. Because the canyon is, more than almost any place on Earth, a monument to water, burying the world in layers. Every band of color in that mile-deep wall is a chapter of deposition, sediment laid down underwater, age upon age, each layer sealing the one beneath it, burying whatever the older world contained under the weight of the newer world above. Geology reads those layers as the slow work of shallow seas and deltas and dunes across hundreds of millions of years, and that reading is sound, and I am not overturning it, but feel the resonance anyway. Here, exposed in a single wall, is the visible fact that the deep buries worlds in layers, that what was on the surface becomes the sealed underneath, that the past does not vanish but is pressed down and covered over and locked in stone. The canyon is a cross-section of burial itself. And into that cross-section, according to a newspaper story that will not die, someone once found a door, and behind the door, a sealed complex of chambers, and in the chambers vessels and hieroglyphs, and a seated god and a crypt of the preserved dead, a vault of the drowned world, a sipar in the American rock. If you had read Berossus first, and then read the 1909 article, you would swear the second was written as a sequel to the first. There is a broader idea that travels with all of this, and I will name it plainly, because a great many people who look into this material end up circling it. The idea that the world we live in is not the first world, that there was an older order, more advanced or more knowing or simply other, that was brought down and buried under a great catastrophe of water and mud, and that the reset was engineered rather than accidental, and that the remnants of the first world lie sealed beneath the surface of this one, occasionally surfacing where the earth has been cut deep enough to reach them. You do not have to accept that framework to feel how precisely the Sumerian flood tradition fits it. The Sumerians said the first world was drowned on purpose. They said knowledge was sealed underground to survive the drowning. They said the survivors were told exactly where the vault was and how to open it. And they built their entire understanding of history on the fault line between the world before the flood and the world after, treating that flood not as a story about rain, but as the great dividing burial of everything that came before. The fourth warning, then, drawn into a single hard statement, is this. The Great Flood was not a punishment and not an accident. It was a method, the deliberate use of the deep to bury a world that had grown too knowing, engineered by the ruling power to be total and secret. It nearly succeeded, and the one thing that survived it, besides a thread of living things, was a sealed vault of knowledge buried underground on purpose, hidden against the catastrophe, placed in the earth to be recovered later. The deep has been used to bury a world before. Knowledge from that world was sealed below and left waiting. And a canyon that is itself a monument to burial in layers holds, if an old and stubborn story is to be believed even a little, exactly such a vault cut into its wall. There is a part of the flood story that almost never gets told, and it is the part that proves, beyond any softening, that the flood in the oldest tradition was about population and not about sin, because of what the gods did after the waters receded. When the flood was over and the survivor made his offering, the gods, who had been starving without their human servants to feed them, came crowding down to the sacrifice, and the poem says they gathered over it like flies, desperate, having discovered too late that in wiping out humanity, they had wiped out the ones who fed them. And there was a reckoning among the gods, and Enlil, who had ordered the extermination, was furious to find that a human had survived. And there was an argument, and out of that argument came not a covenant of mercy, but a policy. The gods decided that the problem all along had been numbers, that the flood had been too blunt an instrument, and that what was needed going forward was permanent population control built into the human condition itself. And so, the Atrahasis epic says, they instituted measures. They created categories of women who would not bear children. They established a demon whose specific function was to snatch the infant from the lap of its mother, to make sure that not every birth would add to the count. Yet they wove death and barrenness and infant loss into the fabric of human life on purpose, as a management strategy to keep the noise down, to keep the numbers from ever again reaching the level that had disturbed the master's sleep. That is how the oldest flood story ends. Not with a rainbow, with a birth control regime imposed by the beings who had just tried to drown us all, designed to keep humanity permanently thinned. The fourth warning is not being melodramatic when it calls the flood a method. The text itself treats the entire human population as a herd to be culled and then managed, and it says so, in the driest imaginable terms, as policy. But the Forbidden History reading takes this and names it a reset, and this is a word you will hear again and again in this territory. The idea that the flood was one of several deliberate resets, engineered cullings of the human population, and erasures of human achievement, carried out from above whenever the human race grew too numerous or too advanced or too aware, each one burying the previous world and starting the count over from a remnant. On this reading, the flood is not a unique event, but an instance of a pattern, The periodic drowning or burning or burying of an advanced first world and the reduction of the survivors to a scattered and forgetful few who have to begin again from almost nothing, remembering the drowned world only as a golden age of gods and giants before the catastrophe. I give you this reading as interpretation. The mainstream reads the flood traditions as the memory of real but local catastrophes, the genuinely devastating river floods of a civilization built on a flat plain between two unpredictable rivers, magnified by memory and theology into a cosmic event, and it reads, the population measures in Atrahasis as an ancient people's mythological explanation for the ordinary hard facts of infant mortality and barrenness, not as evidence of a management regime imposed from outside. That reading is sober and strong, but the pattern it explains is, once again, the pattern of a buried world and an engineered reduction, told by the people who invented writing, in the oldest long story we possess. And now look at what the canyon holds, because the canyon contains the single most literal image of an erased and buried age anywhere on the surface of the earth, and it is not a legend, it is hard geology with a name. Down near the bottom of the canyon, where the ancient Vishnu schist meets the layered rock above it, there is a boundary, a line in the wall, and at that line something staggering has happened, something so extreme that geologists gave it a name that sounds like it came out of the forbidden tradition itself. They call it the Great Unconformity. At that line, more than 1 billion years of rock is simply gone. The layers that should record over 1 billion years of the Earth's history are missing, stripped away, erased, so that rock of one age sits directly on rock more than 1 billion years older, with the whole vast span between them vanished as if it had been scraped off the face of the world. This is real. This is in every geology textbook. The Great Unconformity is one of the most famous features in all of Earth science, a place where you can lay your hand across a single line in the rock and span more than 1 billion years of erased time, an age of the world that left almost no record because whatever it contained was ground away and carried off before the next layers were laid down. Geology has explanations for it, involving ancient erosion and the rising and falling of the land and the scouring of the surface over immense spans, and those explanations are legitimate. But feel the resonance, because you cannot help it. Here, in the wall of the very canyon whose peaks bear the names of the drowned gods, the Earth itself has an erased age, a missing world, 1 billion years scraped away and buried under what came after, marked by a line the scientists themselves called great and called an unconformity, a place where the record of a world was removed. The Sumerians said the deep buries worlds and erases ages. The canyon, in its own stone, in a feature named a century before anyone connected it to anything, simply is the burial of an erased age, made visible, a mile down, where the oldest rock meets the line beyond which 1 billion years went missing. There is a detail in how the survivor was warned that matters enormously, because it is the model for every warning in this whole tradition, including the one you are listening to now. Enki, the god of the deep and the friend of humanity, had sworn an oath with the other gods not to reveal the coming flood to any human being. He was bound. He could not simply walk up to his favored man and tell him what was coming. So he found a way through the letter of his oath. He went to the reed wall of the man's house, the woven reed fence of the dwelling, and he spoke to the wall. He addressed the reeds. Now he said, reed wall, hear me." And then he spoke aloud, to the wall, the warning of the flood and the instructions for the boat, while the man, on the other side of the reeds, listened. Enki did not tell the man. He told the wall, and let the man overhear. He kept his oath to the letter and broke it in spirit, and by that sideways trick, that warning delivered indirectly, aimed past the person it was meant for so that it could reach him without technically being given to him. The human race survived the flood. Sit with the strangeness of that, because it is the template. The most important warning in the history of the world was delivered obliquely, spoken to a wall, meant to be overheard, disguised as something not quite addressed to its true audience. The whole tradition of buried and encoded and indirect warning, the message pressed into clay and left in the ground, the meaning hidden in the names on a canyon, the truth spoken sideways so that it can slip past the ones who would suppress it and reach the one who needs it, begins here, with a god speaking urgently to a fence, while the man he is trying to save leans close on the other side and listens with his whole life. And then there is the door of the boat. When the survivor had built his great vessel and loaded aboard his family and the animals and the seed of every living thing, the last act before the waters came was the sealing of the door. In the Babylonian telling, the survivor speaks of it plainly, that he entered the boat and sealed the door, closed it and sealed it shut with pitch against the coming deluge, and that a particular person was entrusted with the sealing The closing of the vessel against the flood. The one refuge from the drowning of the world was a sealed vessel, a container closed and made watertight and shut against the outside, a thing whose whole function was to keep the inside sealed off from the catastrophe outside. The flood buries the world, and salvation is a sealed box that rides above the burial. Notice how the seal changes sides here without changing its nature. Everywhere else in these warnings, the seal keeps the dangerous thing shut in, down, away. Here, the seal keeps the precious thing shut safely off from the danger. It is the same act, the sealing of a chamber against what is outside, and the fourth warning holds both meanings at once. The flood is the sealing away of a whole world under the water, and the ark as the one sealed chamber that survived it, the burial and the refuge. The tomb and the vault, the same sealed door read from two sides. The mainstream account of the flood traditions, which I have given already and which stands, is that they remember real and terrible local floods magnified by memory and theology. But it is worth saying that the science of ancient catastrophe has itself grown stranger and larger in the last century, in ways that make the old certainty against any great flood less comfortable than it used to be. Geologists now accept, on overwhelming evidence, that the Earth has in fact been reshaped, more than once, by mega-floods of almost unimaginable scale, sudden cataclysmic releases of water that carved whole landscapes in days, stripped the soil from vast regions down to the bare rock, and left the marks of their passage across continents. These are real, established, mainstream science now, though they were mocked for decades when first proposed. No serious scientist claims these mega-floods drowned the whole Earth at once or match the biblical or Babylonian deluge in scope. But the discovery that the surface of the Earth really has been carved and stripped and reshaped by sudden catastrophic floods of a scale no human had witnessed, floods that were denied by the science of their own day until the evidence became undeniable, should make anyone a little more humble about declaring, with total confidence, exactly what the human memory of catastrophic water does and does not preserve. The canyon itself, the greatest cut in the surface of the continent, is a monument to the power of water to carve the deep earth, and while its making was the slow work of ages and not a single flood, its very existence is a mile-deep reminder that water is the force that opens the ground and lays the buried layers bare, which is precisely what the fourth warning says the flood was for, which forces the fifth warning into the open, the one that asks the question you have surely already begun to ask. If there was a first world, and if it was buried, then where are its cities, and its kings, and its dead? The Sumerians kept a list, and the list is stranger than anything we have looked at yet. The fifth warning is written in the form of a bureaucratic document, which is precisely what makes it so unsettling, because bureaucratic documents do not lie for fun. A poem might reach for wonder. A hymn might exaggerate for praise. But a list, a dry administrative list of who ruled where and for how long, has no obvious reason to invent, and the Sumerians left us exactly such a list, and it is one of the most disturbing objects to survive from the ancient world. Not because of what it dramatizes, but because of what it simply, flatly, records. It is called the Sumerian King List, and it exists in many copies, pressed into clay across centuries. You're not people, because it mattered to the Sumerians and their heirs the way a founding charter matters, the document that established who had the right to rule by tracing the line of kingship back to its source. And it opens with a sentence that sets the tone for everything after it. When kingship descended from heaven, it says, "Kingship was in Eridu." Sit with the strangeness of that opening. Kingship, the institution of rule itself, is described not as a thing that human beings developed, but as a thing that descended, that came down from above and was set into place in a particular city, the city of Enki, the city of the Iabzu, the city built over the doorway to the deep. The list begins by telling you that the right to rule was installed from outside, lowered into the first city, at the same seam where the surface world meets the world below. And then the list starts naming names and giving numbers, and the numbers are where the ground drops out from under you. The first king, Alulim, ruled in Eridu, the list says, for 28,800 years. His successor ruled for 36,000 years. The kingship passed to other cities, to Bad Tabira, to Larak, to Sippar, to Shuruppak, and the reigns pile up in the same impossible register, tens of thousands of years each, kings ruling for spans that dwarf the entire span of recorded human history several times over, a handful of rulers accounting between them for hundreds of thousands of years. 8 kings, in the standard version, before the flood. 8 kings, and among the 8 they reign for something on the order of 250,000 years. And then comes the line that divides the whole document in two. the line that every copy preserves, plain and terrible in its brevity. Then the flood swept over. Then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, and kingship had descended from heaven a second time, the list resumes, and the reigns after the flood are still long by our standards, still measured in centuries and then in generations, but they come down, steadily, out of the impossible register and toward the human one, until by the end of the list, the kings are ruling for spans that a modern person can recognize, decades, ordinary reigns of ordinary length. The whole document is a slope, a descent from the unthinkable antediluvian reigns down through the long post-diluvian ones to the plainly historical kings at the bottom. And the pivot of the descent, the great cliff in the middle of the slope, is the flood. Before the flood, kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years. The flood. After the flood, kings who ruled for something closer to a human lifetime. The list is not only a record of rulers, it is a record of a change in the very nature of what a ruler was, a change that happened at the flood, a diminishment, a falling off, as if the flood did not only drown the first world but altered the terms on which life itself was held. The mainstream reading of these numbers is careful and reasonable, and I will give it to you in full, because the fifth warning does not need to hide from it. Scholars point out that the antediluvian figures are not random. They are built out of the Sumerian counting system, which was sexagesimal, based on 60 rather than 10, and the great reign lengths resolve neatly into round products of 60 and its factors, into squares and multiples that suggest the numbers are schematic rather than literal, symbols of legitimacy and cosmic order rather than an actual tally of years. On this reading, the long reigns are a kind of numerology, a way of clothing the earliest kings in the grandeur of enormous numbers to signal that they belong to a founding age, a golden time before the flood, and that the diminishing reigns afterward express a sense, common to many ancient cultures, that the past was greater than the present, and that human beings had fallen from an earlier and longer-lived state. That is a sober and respectable explanation, and there is real truth in it. The numbers are patterned. They are not a naive census. But notice what the sober explanation concedes, even as it explains, because this is the move that the fifth warning turns on. The sober explanation agrees that the Sumerians believed in a first world, an age before the flood, that was categorically different from the world after, populated by rulers of a different order, longer-lived, closer to the source, installed directly from above, reigning for spans that set them entirely apart from ordinary human history. Whether the specific numbers are literal or symbolic, the belief they encode is the same belief that runs through every warning we have examined. There was a first world. It was different. It was greater and stranger and closer to the powers of the deep and the sky. And it ended, all at once, in a flood that buried it and divided history in two. The king list is the census of the drowned world. It is the roster of the buried age. And it insists, in the driest possible voice, that the buried age was real, that it had cities you could name, Eridu and Bad Tabira, and Larak and Sippar, and Shuruppak, and kings you could count, and a definite end. Here is the detail that turns the king list from an academic curiosity into something with a cold edge. Those cities are not imaginary. Eridu is a real place. You can go to it. It is a mound of ruins in the south of Iraq, and archaeologists have dug into it and found, layer beneath layer beneath layer, the successive rebuildings of the Temple of Enki, the Abzu, going down through time to the very oldest levels of Sumerian settlement, some of the oldest urban levels anywhere on Earth. Shuruppak is real, the city the flood hero came from, and it too is a mound that has been excavated, and its excavators found, at a certain depth, a layer of flood deposit, a band of water-laid silt sitting between the levels of human occupation, physical evidence that at some point a great inundation buried the city and life resumed on top of the burial. The Sumerians told us their first world was drowned and buried, and when we dug where they told us to dig, we found cities that had, in fact, been drowned and buried, with the flood layer preserved in the ground like a bookmark between two ages. And this is the pattern that should be ringing in your ears by now, because it is the same pattern in a new setting. The first world is not on the surface. The first world is under the ground. To find the cities of the buried age, you do not sail to them or ride to them. You dig down to them, through the accumulated layers of everything that came after, until you reach the level where the old world lies sealed beneath the new. The Sumerians did not remember their oldest cities as ruins standing in the open. They remembered them as a buried thing, an under thing, a world you reach by going down. Kingship descended from above, and the world it ruled descended in turn beneath the flood, and now it waits, layered over, sealed under the silt, recoverable only by those who know where to dig, and are willing to go down into the earth after it. Which raises the question the fifth warning cannot avoid and does not try to. If the first world was buried, and if its cities lie sealed beneath the surface, then the first world is not confined to one river valley and a rock. A global flood, in the way these traditions describe it, buries a global first world. And the remnants of that first world, its cities and its structures and its dead, would lie sealed not only under the mounds of Mesopotamia, but wherever the deep swallowed the old order and the new world settled on top of it. The Sumerian material gives us the template, the buried city, the flood layer, the sealed age beneath the living one, and then it leaves us to wonder how many other places on the earth hold the same buried template, undug, unnamed, waiting under the accumulated weight of the world that replaced them. The old newspaper account of the canyon reads, "In this light, like a report of exactly such a place found and entered, recall what the article claimed, not a natural cave, a citadel, an underground city, a network of finished chambers and corridors cut into the rock, running for what was described as miles, containing the manufactured goods and the written records, and the preserved dead of some vanished people, all of it sealed away in the deep wall of the canyon." Set that beside the king list's picture of the first world, a world of cities installed from above, ruled by beings of a different order, buried under a great flood and sealed beneath the surface, and the two accounts describe the same kind of object. A buried city of the drowned age, a sealed vault of a first world. The king list says such places exist and were put underground by the flood. The article claims one was found underground in the wall of the deepest canyon on the continent. Whatever you make of the article, you cannot say that its central claim is foreign to the oldest traditions of the human race. Its central claim is those traditions, dressed in the clothes of a 1909 expedition. And there is one more strand in the king list that I have to raise, carefully, because it connects to a body of claims that is both persistent and heavily disputed, and I am going to give you both the claim and the dispute and let you weigh them. The antediluvian kings of the list are not only long-lived, in the broader traditions that grew up around them, in the way later peoples remembered the age before the flood, the first world was often imagined as a world of great beings, of men larger and stronger and longer lived than ourselves, a heroic age of giants that the flood swept away. This is not only a Mesopotamian idea. The Hebrew scriptures, drawing on the same ancient Near Eastern soil, place in the days before their flood a race of great ones on the earth, the offspring of the sons of the gods and the daughters of men, mighty ones of old, men of renown, and it is their world too that the flood destroys. The memory of a buried first world is very often, across these related traditions, a memory of a buried world of giants. Now here is where I have to be scrupulous, because this is exactly the sort of territory where a documentary can slide from the defensible into the fabricated, and I will not do that to you. Across the 19th and early 20th centuries, American newspapers, including many respectable ones, printed a great number of accounts of enormous human skeletons being dug out of the ancient burial mounds that dot the eastern and midwestern United States. Skeletons said to measure 7 and 8 and 9 feet and more, sometimes with unusual features, found by farmers and railway crews and amateur diggers as the mounds were opened and leveled. These accounts are real accounts. The newspapers really printed them. That much is a matter of record, and not in dispute. What is deeply in dispute, and what the mainstream firmly rejects, is whether the accounts were true, and the mainstream position, which deserves to be stated clearly, is that they were a mixture of honest misidentification, exaggeration, hoax, and the general appetite of the period for a sensational story, and that no verified giant skeleton has ever been produced for examination, and that the mound builders were the ancestors of the living native peoples of the continent, ordinary human beings of ordinary size, whose genuine and remarkable earthworks were vandalized and misattributed by a settler culture that did not want to credit them to the people it was displacing. That is the sober verdict, and it carries real weight, and I am not going to pretend it away in order to sell you a thrill. But hold the two things together, the way this whole documentary has asked you to hold two things together, and feel the friction between them. On one side, a global tradition, running from Sumer through the Hebrew scriptures and beyond, that the first world was a buried world of great beings ended by a flood. On the other, a strange and stubborn record, in the newspapers of a continent whose deepest canyon carries the names of the drowned gods, of enormous bones coming up out of the ground as the ancient mounds were opened. The friction does not prove anything. It is not meant to. It is meant to make you notice that the oldest written traditions of the human race and the buried ground of the American continent keep, uncomfortably, telling the same kind of story, and that the official explanations, sound as they are in each individual case, I have to keep working to hold the pattern down. Still, it is worth slowing down over the names in that list, because they are not a blur, they are specific, and one of them in particular connects the fifth warning back to everything we have already seen. The first king in Eridu was Alulim. After him came a second king in the same city, and then the kingship moved to Bad Tabira, and to Larak, and to Sippar, and to Shuruppak, each city with its named rulers, a whole dynasty of the drowned age set down in order. And the king of Sippar, the fifth of the antediluvian cities, bore a name that scholars render as Enmeduranki, or in its longer form, a name meaning something like the Lord of the Bond between heaven and earth. And this king is remembered in the tradition as the one to whom the gods gave the secret knowledge, the one who was taken up and shown the tablet of the gods and taught the arts of divination, the reading of the signs by which the will of heaven could be known. The seventh antediluvian king, the ruler of the city of the sun, was the keeper of the secret knowledge, the one who bridged heaven and earth, the recipient of the divine tablet. Readers of the Hebrew scriptures have long noticed that this figure, the seventh from the beginning, taken up by the divine keeper of secret knowledge, occupies exactly the position and the character of a figure in the biblical genealogy of the age before the flood, the seventh from the first man, who walked with God and was taken, and around whom an entire literature of secret heavenly knowledge later gathered. The same slot, the same number, the same role, in two traditions drawing on the same ancient Near Eastern ground. The fifth warnings list is not a bare roster. It is a record of a first world that included, at its heart, a king who held the secret knowledge and the bond between heaven and earth, and whose city, Sippar, the city of the sun, is the very place where the tradition says the knowledge of the first world was buried before the flood to survive the drowning. The buried world had a keeper of secrets, and his city was the vault. The Forbidden History reading of the King list is the boldest reading in this entire documentary, and I state it as interpretation. On that reading, the list means exactly what it says. Kingship descended from heaven, literally, lowered from above by the ones who came down, installed in the first city. The antediluvian kings were long-lived because they were close to the source, hybrids or favorites or direct appointees of the beings who ruled, and their reigns of tens of thousands of years record a first world in which the human lifespan itself was different, longer, closer to the condition of the ones who made us, before the flood and its aftermath cut us down to the brief span we know. The diminishing reigns after the flood record the withdrawal of that closeness, the falling away of the human race from the age of direct rule into the age of ordinary mortality. And the whole list, on this reading, is not myth, but memory. The genuine dynastic record of the world before the reset, kept because it was true. The mainstream reading, which I have already given and which deserves to stand beside this one, is that the numbers are sexagesimal symbols of a golden founding age, that the descent of kingship is a theological claim about the divine origin of the institution rather than a report of visitors, and that the whole document is a political charter dressed in the grandeur of enormous numbers, not a census of a lost civilization. Both readings agree on the one fact that matters for the pattern. The Sumerians believed, with total conviction, in a first world before the flood, categorically different from ours, ruled by beings of a longer and greater order, and buried by the deluge beneath the world we know. And here the canyon offers something better than a legend, because it offers a genuine archaeological mystery, real objects, really found, in really inaccessible places, that no one fully understands. High in the walls of the Grand Canyon, in caves set in the sheer faces of the Redwall limestone, caves that are extraordinarily difficult to reach, and that offer nothing to a casual visitor, explorers and archaeologists have found small figurines, animals, made by splitting and folding single twigs into the shapes of deer and bighorn sheep, placed deliberately in these remote high caves and left there. They are real. They are genuinely ancient, thousands of years old, older than the Pueblos, made by a people we know almost nothing about, and they were carried up into caves that a person can barely reach and set down in the dark and left, apparently as offerings, in places chosen precisely for their inaccessibility. Think about what that means as a fact on the ground, stripped of all speculation. For thousands of years, human beings have been climbing into the sealed high caves of the Grand Canyon to place objects in the deep and dark and leave them there, treating those hidden hollows in the wall as sacred, as fit to receive an offering, as thresholds worth the terrible climb. The impulse, the fifth warning describes, the sense that the deep places of the canyon are special and that they connect to something that deserves reverence and offering, is not a modern invention laid over the rock. It is thousands of years old. and it is documented in the twigs bent into the shapes of animals and left in the dark of caves that almost no one can reach. The mainstream explanation is that these were hunting magic, ritual offerings by an archaic hunting people, and that explanation is sound. But the deeper fact remains that for as long as human beings have known this canyon, they have treated its sealed high places as sacred and gone to great and dangerous lengths to leave offerings in the dark of them, as if they too, like the Sumerians, understood the deep places of the world to be doorways that must be honored and not disturbed. There is a strand of this that I have to handle with real care, because it is where the forbidden history tradition is at its most seductive and also at its most false. And honesty requires that I give you both the pull of it and the hard correction. Through the 1800s and into the early 1900s, American newspapers were full of reports of giant skeletons, enormous human bones, 7 and 8 and 9 feet tall and more, dug out of the burial mounds that dotted the eastern and central parts of the continent. The reports were specific and confident and endless. A skeleton here, a jaw that fit over a living man's face there, a row of giant dead in a mound somewhere else, and they fed a seductive idea that before the native peoples there had been an earlier and greater race, a vanished civilization of giants and mound builders, a lost first world on this continent, to match the drowned first world of Sumer. And you can feel how neatly that idea slots into the fifth warning, a buried race of giant antediluvian beings, a first world under the soil, exactly what the King List describes, surfacing from the mounds of America. It is a thrilling fit, and it is, in almost every particular, false. And the way it is false matters more than the thrill. The giant skeletons were not real. Not one of them was ever preserved and verified and placed in a collection where it could be examined. They dissolved, or were lost, or were never quite produced, or turned out to be the misidentified bones of animals, or were simple hoaxes, of which that era produced a great many, in a culture with a bottomless appetite for a marvel and newspapers happy to sell it. And the deeper falsehood, the one that does real harm, is the idea of the vanished race itself, because the mounds were not built by a lost civilization of giants. They were built by the ancestors of the living native peoples of this continent, by ordinary human beings of ordinary size, whose descendants were still there, and the fantasy of a vanished superior race was a convenient story for a settler culture in the middle of displacing those descendants, because a people who did not build the great works of their own land are easier to remove from it. The myth of the mound builder giants was not innocent. It was a theft, the stealing of a real people's real achievements and handing them to an imaginary vanished race in service of taking their land. I will not repeat that theft here. The mounds were built by the ancestors of the native nations. They were a genuine and great achievement of real and known peoples, and the giants were a fiction. That is the honest correction, and it is not a small footnote. It is the heart of the matter, and any account of the fifth warning that leaves it out is not telling you the truth. And yet the fifth warning does not actually need the giants, and this is the point worth holding on to once the fiction is cleared away. The genuine record is strange enough. The buried cities of Sumer are real, excavated, and really lie beneath layers of flood silt. Then the King List really does insist on a first world of enormously long-lived rulers before a deluge. The traditions of a race of great beings before the flood are real traditions, found not only in Sumer but woven into the scriptures that grew from the same ground, where it is written, in the verses just before the story of the flood, that there were giants in the earth in those days, mighty ones of old, men of renown, and that their presence was among the reasons the flood was sent. That verse is real and ancient, and it sits exactly where the fifth warning says the first world sits, in the age before the drowning. The tradition of a greater first world buried by the flood is genuinely old and genuinely widespread, and does not depend in the slightest on 19th century newspaper hoaxes about American giants. The hoaxes are false, and the theft they served was real and wrong. But underneath the hoaxes, in the oldest and most serious texts, the fifth warning stands on its own, a sober and ancient conviction, held by the first writers on earth, that before our world there was another, greater and longer lived, and that the flood put it under the ground. The fifth warning, then, drawn to a point, is this. The Sumerians kept a census of the first world, and the census insists that a buried age was real, with named cities that we have in fact dug up and found drowned, ruled by beings of a different and greater order, and that this first world was not destroyed and scattered on the surface, but buried, sealed beneath the layers of everything that followed, recoverable only by going down. And the template of the buried first world is real, verified in the ground of Mesopotamia, and there is nothing in the Sumerian material that confines that template to one valley. It invites the question of how many buried first worlds lie sealed under the surface of the earth, undug, and it makes the old story of a sealed citadel in the wall of the Grand Canyon read not as an absurdity but as one more instance of the oldest pattern the human race has ever recorded, which leaves only the question of what such a buried world would contain that would justify sealing it so thoroughly, guarding it so carefully, and forbidding it so absolutely. The sixth warning answers that. Because the most dangerous thing in the deep, the Sumerians said, was never the gold and never the dead, it was the knowledge. And there was a particular kind of knowledge that they insisted must never be read. The sixth warning is the one that the whole tradition guards most jealously, and it is the reason all the other seals exist, because at the bottom of everything the Sumerians were afraid of, beneath the bound power in the deep and the withdrawn sages and the guarded gate and the buried world, there was a particular kind of thing that they believed must never fall into the wrong hands. And it was not a weapon, and it was not a treasure. It was knowledge. Not knowledge in general, which they loved, but a specific and terrible category of knowledge. The knowledge of how reality is actually run, the operating code of the world, the decrees and names and instructions that determine what things are and what happens to them. They believed that such knowledge existed, that it was written down, that it was concentrated in certain objects and certain words, and that whoever held it held the controls of existence itself. And they believed, above all, that it had to be kept locked away, because in the wrong hands it could unmake the ordered world. We've already met the smaller version of this, the me, the divine decrees held by Enki and the Abzu, the operating principles of civilization that could be handed over, stolen, drained out of the deep like water from a well. But there was a greater and more concentrated version, an object so central to the Sumerian and Babylonian understanding of power that whoever possessed it was, by definition, the ruler of the cosmos, and it was called the Tablet of Destinies. The Tablet of Destinies was not a book of prophecy. It was closer to a master key, or a deed of ownership, or a control panel. To hold it was to hold the power to fix the fates of gods and men, to decree what would be, to bind reality to your word. Supreme authority in the universe was not a matter of strength alone. It was a matter of who physically held the Tablet of Destinies, the written concentration of the power to determine outcomes. And because it was an object, it could be taken. That is the terrible instability at the heart of the sixth warning. The controls of reality were not an abstraction safely lodged in the nature of things. They were a thing, a made thing, an artifact of knowledge that could be picked up and carried off by whoever got their hands on it. And it was carried off, which is the story the sixth warning is built around. There is a Babylonian myth about a being called the Anzu, a monstrous creature, part eagle and part lion, a storm bird of enormous power, who served in the household of the chief god and who was trusted, and who watched, day after day, as the chief god set aside the Tablet of Destinies to bathe, laying the controls of the universe down within reach. And the Anzu, consumed by the desire for the power the tablet held, waited for his moment and seized it, snatched the Tablet of Destinies and flew off with it into the mountains, and in that instant the ordered world came apart. The myth is vivid about the consequence. When the tablet was taken, the divine order was suspended, the powers that hold reality together were thrown into confusion. Authority itself was in the hands of a thief, and the whole cosmos hung in the balance until the tablet could be recovered. It took a champion, the warrior god Ninurta, a long and difficult battle to hunt the Anzu down in the mountains and destroy him and return the Tablet of Destinies to its keeper and restore the order that its theft had broken. The whole affair reads as a warning about exactly one thing, that the concentrated knowledge of how reality is run is an object, that objects can be stolen, and that the theft of that particular object is not a crime like other crimes, but a tearing of the fabric of the world, a thing that suspends order itself until it is set right. The same terror runs through the great creation epic, the Enuma Elish, at its climax. When the young god Marduk goes out to face the primordial mother of chaos, Tiamat, the thing that has made her champion so dangerous, the thing that makes the battle a battle for the fate of everything, is that Tiamat has given the Tablet of Destinies to her chosen consort, has fastened the controls of reality onto the breast of her champion, so that the war is not merely a war of strength, but a struggle for possession of the master key. And when Marduk wins, the first thing he does, the very first act of the new ruler of the cosmos, is to take the Tablet of Destinies from the defeated champion and seal it to his own breast, to seize the controls, because without them, victory would mean nothing. The lesson is pressed home again. Power in the deepest sense is possession of the written knowledge of how reality works, and that knowledge is an object, and the entire order of the world depends on that object being held by the right keeper and kept out of every wrong hand. There is a quieter story that sharpens the sixth warning to its finest point, and it concerns a human being, the first of the sages, a man named Adapa, whom Enki himself had made exceptionally wise, wiser than any man before or since, given understanding to a degree no ordinary human was ever meant to possess. Adapa is the human face of the sixth warning, the case study in what happens when the deep pours too much knowing into a single mortal, and his story turns on a moment of withheld knowledge that has troubled readers for as long as it has been read. Adapa, in his great wisdom and his great temper, breaks the wing of the south wind when it capsizes his fishing boat, and for this, he is summoned up to the heaven of the high god to answer for what he has done. And before he goes, his patron Enki, ever the one who warns, coaches him, tells him how to behave, how to win the sympathy of the gatekeepers of heaven, and then gives him one specific and fateful instruction. When you are before the high god, Enki says, they will offer you bread and they will offer you water, and you must refuse them because the bread they offer is the bread of death and the water they offer is the water of death, and if you take them, you will die. So Adapa goes up, and he does exactly as he was told, and when the high god, unexpectedly pleased with him, offers him the bread of life and the water of life, the food that would have made him immortal, Adapa refuses it because Enki told him to refuse, believing it to be the food of death. And so the one man wise enough to be offered the immortality of the gods turns it down, on the advice of the god who loved him, and the chance is lost. And Adapa returns to earth immortal, and dies like every other man. Scholars have argued for a century about what this story means, about whether Enki tricked his own protege or genuinely misjudged, about why the one being, who might have bridged the gap between humanity and the gods, was steered away from the crossing at the last step. But for our purposes, the meaning is stark and clear. There is a line, and the deep does not want a human being to cross it. Wisdom. Yes, the deep will pour out wisdom, will make a man wiser than any man. But the final knowledge, the knowledge that would actually change what a human being is, that would let a mortal step across into the register of the gods, that knowledge is withheld, steered away from, kept back, even by the friendly god, even from his own favorite, even at the cost of the man's immortality. The deep gives knowledge, and gives it lavishly, right up to the edge of the line that must not be crossed. And at that edge, even our best friend among the powers turns us gently away from the last door. Put the Tablet of Destinies and the story of Adapa side by side, and you have the full shape of the sixth warning. On one side, the knowledge that runs reality is an object, concentrated and portable and stealable, and its theft unmakes the world, so that the entire order of things depends on keeping that concentrated knowledge locked away and out of the wrong hands. On the other side, even for the wisest and best-intentioned mortal, there is a final threshold of knowing that must not be crossed, that is deliberately withheld, that the friendly powers steer us away from, at the cost of everything we might have gained. The two stories agree. Some knowledge is too dangerous to be free, some knowledge has to be sealed, and the sealing of that knowledge is not cruelty, it is the maintenance of the world. The Sumerians did not fear knowledge because they were superstitious. They feared a specific knowledge because they understood it as the controls of reality, and they had watched in their stories what happened every time those controls slipped into the wrong grip. Chaos, the suspension of order, the world hanging by a thread until the stolen thing could be recovered and locked away again. Now bring this to the canyon and to the vault in the wall, because the sixth warning is the one that transforms the meaning of the old newspaper story from a tale of buried treasure into something far more serious. Recall that the 1909 account did not merely describe gold and vessels and the preserved dead. It described writing. It described hieroglyphs cut into the stone, tablets, inscriptions, a written record left in the sealed chambers, the accumulated learning of whoever built the place, set down in a script and left in the dark. If the account describes anything real at all, then what it describes is not primarily a treasure vault, it is a library. It is a sealed repository of the written knowledge of a vanished world, exactly the sort of thing the sixth warning tells us is the most dangerous object there is, the concentrated knowledge of how a lost civilization understood and manipulated reality, locked underground, sealed against recovery. And the sixth warning tells us precisely why such a thing would be sealed with more care than any tomb of gold. Gold in the wrong hands makes a thief rich. Knowledge of this kind in the wrong hands unmakes the ordered world. You would not seal a library of the deep to protect the books. You would seal it to protect everyone outside from the books. There is a dimension of the sixth warning that runs even deeper than the Tablet of Destinies, and it concerns the power the Sumerians and Babylonians attached to names, to the true name of a thing, because to them, a name was not a label but a lever, a handle on the reality of the thing named, and to know the true name of something was to have power over it. This is why the great creation epic ends not with a battle but with a naming, with the assembled gods proclaiming the 50 names of the victorious Marduk, each name a decree of a power and a function, the recitation of the names being the actual installation of his authority over the cosmos. To name was to fix, to bind, to determine. And the most dangerous knowledge of all, in this scheme, was the knowledge of the true names, the secret names, the names of the gods, and the names of the powers, because whoever held a true name held the controls of the thing it named. Magic, in the Mesopotamian understanding, was very largely the knowledge and the correct use of names and formulas, the operating language of reality, and the greatest of that knowledge was guarded most closely, because a true name in the wrong mouth was a weapon against the order of the world. Put this beside the Tablet of Destinies, and the me and you have a consistent picture of what the sixth warning fears. It fears an operating language, a set of names and decrees and formulas that constitute the actual controls of reality, written down, concentrated, portable, and stealable, whose possession is power and whose loss to the wrong hands is catastrophe. The knowledge that must never be read is not information for its own sake. It is the source code, and the Sumerians understood, better perhaps than we do, that source code in the wrong hands does not merely inform, it executes. The forbidden history reading of all this is nearly irresistible, and I give it to you as interpretation and nothing more. On that reading, the Tablet of Destinies is a device, a physical technology that stored and ran the controls of some system the ancients did not have the vocabulary to describe, and the me are something like programs or protocols, discrete functions that could be transferred and installed, and the true names are command words, and the whole apparatus is the remembered fragment of a technology of control that belonged to the ones who came down, and that was, in the end, sealed away because it was too dangerous to leave in circulation. The story of the Anzu who stole the tablet and threw the cosmos into chaos becomes, on this reading, the memory of a control system seized by the wrong operator, and its recovery, the memory of that system being secured again. I will not pretend this is what the texts plainly say. It is a reading imposed upon them, and the mainstream rejects it as anachronism, as the projection of modern computing and modern technology backward onto a religious and magical worldview that must be understood on its own ancient terms, in which names and decrees have power because the world is enchanted, not because it is engineered. That objection is correct as far as it goes, and the ancient worldview really was one of living powers and sacred names, not machines. But the shape of the fear is the same shape either way. The fear of a concentrated, portable knowledge that is the controls of reality, and that must be sealed away from every wrong hand, and that shape is what the sixth warning is built around, and it is a shape our own age, of all ages, should find easy to recognize. And here is the fact that should stop you cold, because it collapses the distance between the ancient warning and our own moment entirely. The knowledge of the Sumerians was, in actual historical fact, buried and lost and then dug up and read again, and the reading of it is recent, and it happened within the span of a few human lifetimes. For thousands of years, the cuneiform tablets lay in the ground under the mounds of Iraq, and the language on them was utterly dead, unread, unreadable, a knowledge sealed in the earth as completely as anything in any legend. And then, in the 1800s, men dug them up and, over decades of painstaking work, cracked the script and the languages and began, for the first time in millennia, to read the words of the first writers on earth. The buried knowledge of the first world was recovered, literally, out of the ground, in the recent past, and it is the reason we can have this conversation at all. Everything in this documentary, every warning, exists in our reach only because a sealed and buried knowledge was dug up and deciphered after thousands of years of silence. And here is the uncomfortable turn of the screw. It was in exactly the years when this was happening, when the buried words of Sumer were first being pulled out of the ground and read, when the names of Enki and the Anunnaki and the Abzu were re-entering the world after their long burial, that a newspaper in Arizona printed a story about a sealed underground complex full of the written records and the preserved dead of a vanished Eastern people found in the wall of the Grand Canyon. The buried knowledge was coming up out of the ground in one place, and a story about buried knowledge in a sealed chamber was surfacing in another, in the same decades, as if the whole idea of the recovered vault were in the air of the age pressing to be born. The mainstream would call that the ordinary spirit of a period fascinated by archaeology and lost civilizations, and that is a fair account. But the sixth warning gives it a colder reading, that some knowledge is buried to be saved and some is buried to be sealed away forever, and that an age which has begun digging the first kind out of the ground had better be very sure it can tell the difference before it goes looking for the second. It helps to see the forbidden knowledge itemized, because the Sumerians actually gave us a list, and the list is one of the strangest documents to survive from the ancient world. In the myth of how the goddess Inanna took the me from Enki, the powers are named, dozens of them, recited one after another as she loads them onto her boat and carries them away. And when you read the list, you understand at once what the me are and why their concentration in one place was so dangerous. Because the list does not sort the exalted from the base. It runs them all together as a single set. It names kingship and priesthood and the noble offices. Yet it names truth and the descent into the underworld, and the art of the scribe, and the crafts of the metalworker, and the leatherworker, and the builder. It names music and rejoicing. And in the very same breath, in the same flat recitation, it names deceit and the plundering of cities, and strife and slander, and the making of enemies, and the terror of battle. The good and the terrible, the holy and the profane, the arts that build a civilization and the arts that tear one apart, all of them listed together as the me, the complete operating set of ordered human life, because the Sumerians understood something we prefer to forget, that a civilization is a single package, that you do not get the temple without the army, the law without the prison, the writing without the lie, the crafts without the weapons, that the whole apparatus of ordered life comes as one indivisible set of powers, and that whoever holds the complete set holds everything, the capacity to build and the capacity to destroy, bound together and impossible to separate. That is the forbidden knowledge in its truest form. Not a single dangerous secret, but the entire operating code of civilization, gathered in one place, in one hand, portable, transferable, and total. And the myth tells you the one thing about that knowledge that matters most for the sixth warning, which is that once it is released, it cannot be recalled. Enki held the complete set of the me in his city, in the deep, at the source. And then, in the story, he is feasting with the goddess, and he drinks, and in the generosity and recklessness of drink he begins to give the me away to her, one after another, powers and offices and arts, handing over the operating code of civilization piece by piece, until she has the whole set loaded on her boat and is sailing away with it. And then Enki sobers up, but he realizes what he has done, and he wants it back. He sends his servant and his monsters after the boat again and again to seize the me and return them to the deep, to undo the release, to get the dangerous complete set back behind the seal where it belongs. And he fails. Every attempt fails. The goddess keeps the me and carries them to her city, and the powers are loose in the world and cannot be gathered back. The one who held the forbidden knowledge let it out, and discovered that letting it out is a door that only opens one way, that the seal, once broken, cannot be remade, that you cannot put the released thing back into the deep no matter how many servants and monsters you send after it. This is the sixth warning at its coldest and most precise. The forbidden knowledge is the whole operating code of the world, good and terrible together, and its danger is not only what it can do, but that its release is irreversible, that the breaking of that particular seal is final, that there is no getting the me back on the boat once the boat has sailed, which is exactly why it had to be sealed so carefully in the first place, because the one thing you can never do, once it is out, is close the door again. This casts the whole tradition of buried and recovered knowledge in a new and colder light. Remember the flood and the instruction given to the survivor to bury the tablets at Sippar before the waters came, so that the knowledge of the first world could be dug up and recovered after. That was a rescue, a preservation, knowledge sealed underground to survive a catastrophe and be brought back. But the sixth warning shows us the other face of buried knowledge, the darker reason to put learning in the ground and seal it over. Not to preserve it for recovery, but to bury it so that it can never be recovered, to take a knowledge too dangerous to exist in the open and lock it in the deep and set guardians over it and forbid the door, precisely so that no Anzu, no thief, no bold and restless explorer can ever fly off with the controls of reality in his talons. Some things are buried to be saved, some things are buried to be sealed away forever. And from the outside, from the mouth of the passage in the canyon wall, the two look exactly alike. A door in the rock, a sealed chamber, now a record in the dark. You cannot tell, standing at the threshold, whether the thing behind it was hidden to be kept safe or hidden to keep you safe, and the sixth warning suggests that the difference is the most important thing in the world, and that you will not know which it is until after you have opened it, when it is far too late to close it again. The seventh warning is the last one and the deepest one, and it is the one that finally says out loud the thing all the others have been circling, which is why, why the deep is sealed, why the gate is guarded. Still, why the knowledge is buried and the sages sent home and the first world drowned. The first 6 warnings tell us that the sealing happened and was maintained with enormous care. The 7th tells us the reason, and the reason is the most frightening thing the Sumerians ever wrote down, and they wrote it down more than once, in more than one text, in words so direct that no amount of scholarly caution can soften them. To reach it, we have to go all the way down, past the Abzu of fresh water, past the buried cities, into the lowest place in the Sumerian cosmos, the underworld itself, which they called Kur, the great below, the land of no return. Kur was not hell in the later sense. It was not a place of punishment for the wicked. It was simply the destination of the dead, all of them, good and bad alike, a vast dim realm beneath the earth where the dead went down and stayed, sitting in darkness, clothed like birds in feathers, eating dust and clay, ruled by a queen. And the defining law of Kur, the law that everything about it exists to enforce, is that it is a land of no return. What goes down does not come up. The dead stay dead. The boundary between the living and the dead is absolute, and the underworld is the sealed vessel that keeps it absolute, the great below that holds the dead below so that the world above can belong to the living. Then the most important story the Sumerians told about this sealed realm is the descent of the goddess Inanna, and its structure is the 7th warning made visible, because the descent is a passage through 7 gates, and the 7 gates are 7 seals, and they are there to make sure that crossing the boundary is nearly impossible and never free. Inanna, the great goddess of heaven, the queen of love and war, decides to descend to the underworld, to the domain of her elder sister Ereshkigal, the queen of the dead. And to get there, she cannot simply walk down. She has to pass through 7 gates, one after another, and at each gate, the gatekeeper stops her, and at each gate, she is required to give up something, to remove a garment, a crown, a rod of power, a breastplate, the ornaments and instruments of her divine authority, one at each threshold, until by the time she passes through the 7th gate and comes into the throne room of the dead, she is stripped entirely, naked and powerless. Everything that made her a queen of heaven surrendered at the 7 doors behind her. The 7 gates do not merely admit her, they disarm her. They strip the power off a descending god layer by layer so that whatever passes into the deepest place passes in helpless. That is what a seal is, in the Sumerian understanding. Not just a locked door, but a series of thresholds, each of which takes something from whatever tries to cross, so that nothing arrives at the bottom with the power it started with. And when Inanna finally stands naked before her sister and the 7 judges of the underworld, they fix upon her the eye of death, and they speak against her the word of wrath, and she is struck down, turned into a corpse, and hung on a hook on the wall, a piece of rotting meat in the house of the dead. The great goddess of heaven, dead on a hook in the sealed below. She is rescued only because Enki, the friend in the deep once again, fashions 2 strange, centacless creatures from the dirt under his fingernail and sends them down to slip through the gates and revive her with the food of life and the water of life. But even Enki's cleverness cannot simply undo the law of the land of no return. Inanna can come back up, but the underworld demands its price. The law is that no one ascends from Kur without providing a substitute, a body to take their place, because the boundary must be kept, the count must be kept, the dead below must remain as many as before. And so Inanna is released only on the condition that she sends someone down in her place. And the demons of the underworld, the Gala, ascend with her to make sure the price is paid. And the story ends in the terrible bargain by which her own husband is dragged down to the below so that she can remain among the living. The boundary holds. The seal is maintained. Someone always has to stay down. Now we arrive at the sentence, the one the whole documentary has been walking toward. The plainest statement of why the deep is sealed that the ancient world ever produced. It comes from the same story, in its Babylonian form, the descent of the goddess to the underworld, and it comes at the very threshold. When the goddess arrives at the outermost gate of the below and demands to be let in, she does not ask politely. She threatens the gatekeeper, and her threat is the reason for every seal in this entire tradition, spoken out loud, once, forever. And she says that if the gate is not open to her, if she is not let through, then she will smash the door. She will shatter the doorpost. She will wrench the door off its frame. And then she will raise up the dead, and she will bring the dead up out of the below into the world of the living, and the dead will rise, and they will eat the living, and the dead will outnumber the living. That is the threat. Open the gate, or I will break it. And if I break it, the dead will come up, and they will devour the living, and there will be more dead walking the earth than there are living to walk it. Read that again and understand that this is not a modern horror movie. This is one of the oldest written sentences in the human record, pressed into clay thousands of years ago, and it tells you, with total clarity, exactly why the deep is sealed and what happens if the seal fails. The underworld is sealed to keep the dead down, because if the boundary breaks, if the gates are forced, the dead do not simply escape. They rise, and they consume the living, and they overturn the natural order in which the living outnumber the dead, and the world above belongs to those who breathe. The seventh warning is the reason for all the others. The Abzu is sealed, the sages sent home, the gate guarded, the knowledge buried, the first world drowned, the seven gates locked, all of it, for one reason, which is to keep the boundary between the living and the dead intact, to keep the below, to prevent the moment when the door is broken and the dead come up and the number of the dead is turned loose upon the number of the living. This is the key that unlocks the whole pattern, and it is the key that turns most sharply in the wall of the canyon. Because now go back, one final time, to the 1909 account and look at what sat at the very heart of it. Not the gold, not the vessels, yet not the seated god. At the deepest point of the sealed complex, in the chamber the article did not hesitate to call a crypt, there were said to be the dead, preserved, wrapped, laid in tears, more than could be counted, a great multitude of the sealed dead in the deepest chamber of a sealed structure, in the deepest wall of the deepest canyon on the continent. If you had read the seventh warning first, you would know exactly what kind of place that is. It is a place built to keep the dead down. It is a kur. But it is a sealed below made physical, a great crypt of the tiered dead, closed off and hidden and forbidden, in a canyon whose surveyed heights already carry the names of Osiris and Set, the Egyptian lords of the dead and the pit, and whose deepest stone bears the name of the god who sleeps on the waters between the destructions of the world. And the tribes who have lived in and around that canyon for longer than any settler carry their own version of the same warning, and I raise it with respect and with care, because it is not mine to tell in full, and I will not pretend to an authority over it that I do not have. But it is a matter of record that among the peoples of the region there are traditions of the canyon and its depths as a place of emergence and of the dead, of a passage between worlds, of an underworld from which the living emerged in the ancient time and to which the dead return, of places within the deep earth that are sacred and dangerous and not to be disturbed. The specifics belong to those peoples and I leave them there. But the shape is the same shape, the deep as a boundary between the living and the dead, the below as a place that must be respected and not forced, the canyon as a seam in the world where the two realms come close enough to touch. Across the ocean, and across thousands of years, the first writers of Mesopotamia and the first peoples of the canyon arrived at the same understanding, that the deep places of the earth are where the living and the dead press against each other through a boundary that must be kept, and that some doors are closed because of what waits on the other side. There is a detail in the machinery of the sealed below that ties the seventh warning back to the very first name we learned, and it is this. When the goddess is struck down in the throne room of the underworld, the ones who pronounce the sentence of death upon her, the judges who fix her with the eye of death, are named in the text, and they are the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki, the great gods, the ones the whole forbidden tradition is built around, appear here in their oldest and most specific role, as the seven judges of the dead, seated in the underworld, pronouncing the verdicts that hold the boundary between the living and the dead. This is not a modern embellishment. It is in the oldest text of the descent. The Anunnaki are the judges of the sealed below, the seven who decree, the keepers of the law of no return. And the seventh warning shows them doing their fundamental work, which is not creating humanity and not ruling the surface, but sitting in judgment at the bottom of the world, maintaining the seal, making sure that what goes down stays down. The beings, the whole tradition remembers as the ones who came down, are, at the deepest level, the ones who keep the deepest door, the wardens of the boundary between the living and the dead. Whatever else they were, the oldest texts placed them at the bottom, holding the line, and the Sumerians did not treat the sealed below as a distant abstraction that took care of itself. They treated the maintenance of the boundary as an ongoing obligation of the living, a duty performed continuously, because they believed that the dead, if not properly buried and properly fed, did not stay quietly below. They had a word for the ghost, the spirit of the dead, and they believed that a spirit that was not given its proper burial, or that was not regularly fed by its living descendants with offerings of food and water, would not remain in the below. It would come back up. It would return to the world of the living as a restless and malevolent thing, a hungry ghost that afflicted the living with sickness and misfortune, and a great deal of Mesopotamian ritual was devoted to the feeding of the dead and the laying of the restless spirit, to the continuous work of keeping the dead down and content so that they would not rise and trouble the living. The boundary, in other words, was not self-maintaining. It leaked. The dead pressed against it. And the living had a permanent job, the feeding and the placating and the correct burial, to keep the pressure from building until the boundary failed. The seventh warning is not only the great cosmic threat of the door broken and the dead pouring up in a flood. It is also the small daily fear, the individual restless ghost, the sense that every improperly handled death was a tiny breach in the seal, a single member of the below finding its way back up. Multiply that fear by a whole vanished civilization improperly buried, a whole first world drowned without its rights, and you begin to feel the weight of what a great sealed crypt of the uncounted dead would mean to a people who thought this way. It would be the greatest possible concentration of the pressure that pushes the dead back toward the living, sealed behind the greatest possible door, precisely because the alternative was unthinkable. Now, stand in front of the canyon crypt one final time with all of this in mind. The old newspaper story placed, at the deepest point of the sealed complex, a chamber of the preserved dead, wrapped and laid in tears, more than could be counted. Read through the seventh warning. That is not a burial in our comfortable modern sense, a resting place for the honored dead. It is a containment. It is the sealing of a great multitude of the dead behind a door, in the deep, in a canyon whose heights bear the names of Osiris and Set, the lords of the Egyptian dead and the pit, exactly the sort of overwhelming concentration of the below that the whole Sumerian apparatus of seals and gates and offerings existed to manage and to hold. Whether the crypt in the article was ever real, the shape of it is the shape of the seventh warning. A sealed multitude of the dead in the deep, held behind a door that must not be opened, because of what the Sumerians told us happens when such a door is broken. The forbidden reading says the crypt is real and is exactly what it appears to be, a containment of the dead of a vanished world, sealed by those who understood the danger. The mainstream says the article is a hoax, and the crypt never existed, and the canyon holds no such thing. But the two readings agree on what such a place would mean if it were real. And the meaning is written on the oldest clay we possess, in a threat spoken at the outermost gate of the below. There is another underworld story, less famous than the descent of the goddess, but pointed at exactly the question of the seal, and it tells how the boundary between the below and the above came to be permanently manned. It concerns the god Nergal, and how he came to rule the underworld beside its queen. In the beginning of that story, the two realms, the above and the below, are held strictly apart, and the rule of separation is absolute. So absolute that when the gods of the sky hold a feast, the queen of the dead cannot come up to join them, and they cannot go down to her. And so she sends her messenger up in her place, the one being permitted to cross the boundary in both directions, to carry her portion down. The whole story turns on the crossing of that boundary and on the terrible protocols that guard it, the gates, the passwords, the strict etiquette of who may pass and how, and it ends with Nergal descending and, by one route or another in the different versions, being bound to the underworld, seated beside its queen, made a permanent lord of the below, and the meaning underneath the story is the meaning of the whole seventh warning. The boundary between the living and the dead does not keep itself. It has to be manned. Someone has to be down there, seated, ruling, holding the line, maintaining the separation, or the two realms would bleed into each other, and the order that keeps the dead below the living would fail. The gods did not simply build a wall between the world and the underworld and walk away. They installed wardens, a queen, and then a king beside her, permanent residents of the below whose presence holds the boundary shut, because a boundary that important cannot be left to a lock. It needs a keeper, and the keeper cannot leave, because the moment the throne of the below stands empty, the seal begins to fail. Set that beside the law of substitution from the descent, the rule that no one comes up unless someone goes down, and beside the daily labor of feeding the dead so they do not rise, and a complete picture assembles itself of a boundary maintained by constant effort from both sides, by wardens seated below, and by the living tending their dead above, an entire economy of vigilance devoted to the single task of keeping the door between the living and the dead shut and manned. The seventh warning is not describing a sealed door that anyone can simply walk away from and forget. It is describing a seal that demands a keeper, a boundary that consumes attention and presence and sacrifice without end, held shut only so long as someone stays down there holding it. And that is the final weight the old newspaper's crypt takes on when you read it through all 7 warnings. A chamber of the tiered dead at the heart of a sealed complex in the deep is not a thing you close once and forget. If the 7th warning is right, it is a thing that has to be kept, watched, held, a boundary that someone or something must go on manning in the dark, because the one lesson the Sumerians never stopped repeating is that the door between the living and the dead does not stay shut on its own. Someone always has to stay down. The 7th warning, then, stated as plainly as it has ever been stated, is this: the deep is sealed to keep the dead below the living. Now, the underworld is a land of no return by design, held shut by 7 gates that strip the power from anything that tries to cross, maintained by an absolute law that no one comes up without someone going down, because the boundary between the living and the dead is the boundary the whole ordered world rests upon. And the reason the seal must never be broken was written down once, in a threat spoken at the outermost gate, and it has never been improved upon. Break the door, and the dead will rise, and the dead will eat the living, and the dead will outnumber the living. That is why it was sealed, not to hide a treasure, not to guard a secret for its own sake. To keep the door between the below and the above shut, so that the living world stays a living world. And if there is, in the wall of a canyon in Arizona, a sealed complex with a crypt of the tiered dead at its heart, then the 7th warning tells you precisely what it is, and precisely why someone, at some time, in some age we have forgotten, took such enormous care to close it and to leave it closed. So gather the 7 and hold them in your hand at once, because they were never meant to be read one at a time. They were meant to be read together, as a single warning delivered from 7 directions, and only when you lay them side by side does the full shape stand up out of the clay. The first warning says there is a deep beneath the solid ground, older than the world, and that a dangerous power was bound and sealed at the foundation of things, and a structure built over the seal to hold it and hide it. The second says the knowledge that made our civilization came up out of that seal deep in the hands of 7 beings, and that even this good gift was withdrawn and the beings sent back and shut away, because what comes up from below always brings the deep with it. Still, the third says every passage to the deep is guarded, and the guardian is your last warning, and the greatest hero who ever lived forced such a gate, and it cost him everything. Sideways, on a delay, past all recovery. The fourth says the great flood was not an accident, and not a justice, but a method. The deliberate use of the deep to bury a first world that had grown too, knowing, and that knowledge was sealed underground to survive the burial. The fifth says the buried first world was real, with named cities we have dug up and found drowned, ruled by beings of a different and greater order, and that it lies sealed beneath the surface, recoverable only by going down. Then the sixth says the most dangerous thing in the deep was never the gold or the dead, but a particular knowledge, the concentrated controls of reality itself, that had to be locked away because in the wrong hands it unmakes the ordered world. And the seventh says why, in the end, all of it was sealed, in a threat spoken at the outermost gate of the below, that if the door is broken, the dead will rise and eat the living and outnumber them, and that the whole architecture of seals exists to keep that door shut. 7 warnings, 1 message. There is a door in the deep places of the world, and it was closed on purpose by powers who understood exactly what was on the other side, and the closing of it was one of the founding acts of the ordered world. And the reason it was closed has not gone away just because the human race forgot it was ever written down. And there is a canyon that answers every one of the 7. A canyon whose deepest stone is named for the god who sleeps on the cosmic waters between the destructions of the world. Whose surveyed heights carry the names of Isis and Osiris and Ra and Set, of Buddha and Brahma and Shiva and Zoroaster, the drowned and buried gods of the old world, the deities of the dead and the pit and the destruction and remaking of ages. A canyon with cold, sweet water pouring out of its walls from an unmapped deep, treated as sacred by the people who have lived beside it longest. A canyon that is itself a mile-deep cross-section of burial in layers, the visible proof that the deep swallows worlds and seals them under the weight of what comes after. And a canyon at the heart of which, according to a real newspaper story that a real newspaper really printed in the spring of 1909 and that has refused to die for more than a century since, someone once found a door in the wall, high in an unreachable cliff, and went inside and found a sealed city of finished chambers and radiating corridors, and vessels of copper and unknown metal, and hieroglyphs cut in the stone, and a seated teaching god, and, at the deepest point, a crypt of the preserved dead laid in tiers beyond counting. Every element of the 7 warnings, assembled in one place, in one wall, in one story. Walk the names once more, slowly, because the map of the canyon reads like a roll call of exactly the gods this tradition is about, and a geologist chose them, one by one, in the 1880s, and wrote them onto the summits, and they have been the official names ever since. There is the Isis Temple and the Osiris Temple, the goddess who gathers the pieces of the dead and the god who rules the dead, the very deities of death and resurrection presiding over separate summits of the chasm. There is the Tower of Ra, the sun, And across from the powers of the sun there is the Tower of Set, the god of the desert and the pit, and the murderer of Osiris, the nearest thing the Egyptian world had to a lord of chaos, given a dark tower of his own in the wall of the canyon. And there is the Buddha temple, and the Brahma temple, and the Shiva temple, the enlightened one, and the creator and the destroyer of worlds. And there is the Zoroaster temple, named for the prophet of the long war between light and darkness. And down at the very bottom, under all of them, holding them all up, there is the Vishnu schist, the oldest stone, named for the god who sleeps on the cosmic ocean between the destructions of the world and dreams the universe into being again after each drowning. Lay that pantheon out and look at what it is. It is a gathering of the gods of death, of burial, of the pit, of the destruction and the remaking of ages, of the sleeping preserver on the waters, assembled on the peaks and in the depths of a single canyon, chosen by a man who said he picked them for their grandeur and their mystery, and who never explained, because he could not have, why the grandeur and the mystery he reached for were so precisely the grandeur and the mystery of the drowned and buried world. And each name, if you have walked through the 7 warnings, now rings against a specific one of them. The sleeping preserver at the bottom, on the waters, between the destructions of the world, is the first warning, the deep older than the world with something bound in it. The teaching gods on the heights, the enlightened and the creating, are the second, the knowledge that came up out of the deep. Yet the dark tower of the Lord of the Pit is the third, the guarded and forbidden place. The prophet of the long catastrophe and the god who sleeps between the drownings are the fourth, the flood as the burial of a world. The whole assembled pantheon of a first age of gods, set on the summits of a buried landscape, is the fifth, the drowned first world and its greater rulers. But the mystery the geologist could not explain, the knowledge encoded in the naming that ran ahead of his own understanding, is the sixth, the buried knowledge that surfaces before we are ready for it. And the gatherers and rulers of the dead, Isis and Osiris and Set, presiding over a canyon said to hold a crypt of the tiered dead at its heart, are the seventh, the sealed below, and the door that must not be opened. 7 warnings, and a canyon whose official names, assigned before anyone was looking for a pattern, arranged themselves into the same 7. You can call that the reading habits of one 19th century geologist, and at the level of documented fact, that is exactly what it is. But the man reached into the whole mythology of the human race and pulled out, to name this one canyon, the precise set of gods that the oldest warnings are built around, and he did it without knowing the warnings, and the result is a map on which you can trace all 7 simply by reading the summits from the rim. The interpretation that the forbidden history tradition draws from all of this is bold, and I am going to state it in full and without flinching, because you deserve to hear the strong version of the case before you hear it taken apart. That interpretation says the Sumerians were not writing mythology at all. It says they were writing history, the oldest history, a sober report of a time when beings from elsewhere, the ones they called the Anunnaki, came down to this world, and shaped the human race as a labor force, and ruled openly, and taught, and then, when their age of open rule came to an end, sealed away the evidence of what they were and what they had done. On this reading, the Abzu is a real sealed place. The 7 sages were real beings who really came and really went. The guarded gates are real thresholds to real sealed spaces. The flood was a real engineered catastrophe used to bury a real first world. The buried cities and the long-lived kings are the real record of that first world. The forbidden knowledge is real technology or real command over reality that was deliberately locked away, and the sealed underworld with its crypt of the dead is a real place or a real kind of place that exists in the deep beneath the surface of the earth in more locations than one. And the Grand Canyon, on this reading, is one of those locations, a place where the ceiling came close enough to the surface that men naming its peaks felt the character of what lay below and reached, without knowing why, for the names of the buried gods, and where, once, an explorer found the door in the wall and looked inside and saw the truth. And the truth was quietly buried again, denied, laughed off, and left sealed, exactly as it was meant to be. That is the strong version. It is coherent. It fits every piece. Now, it is the version that has kept this subject alive for 100 years, and it is the version that a great many thoughtful people find, in the small hours, harder to dismiss than they would like. Now, let me give the other side its full weight, because a documentary that only tells you the thrilling version is not informing you, it is flattering you, and you deserve better than flattery. The mainstream reading of every single piece of this has an answer, and the answers are not stupid, and honesty requires that they be laid out as clearly as the case they oppose. The 1909 article is, By the strong consensus of historians, a hoax, or a piece of the sensational filler that frontier newspapers of that era printed routinely to move copies, and the institution it named has stated for over a century that it has no record of the man, the professor, or the expedition. And in the entire time since, not one artifact, not one photograph, not one verifiable trace of the sealed city has ever been produced by anyone. Still, the Egyptian and Hindu names on the canyon's peaks were assigned deliberately by a geologist in the 1880s as a naming theme, a learned man's systematic choice to label the many separate summits after the mythologies of the world, and they record his reading habits, not a buried civilization. The Vishnu schist is called that for the same reason, a naming convention, not a clue. The impossibly long reigns of the king list resolve into the round numbers of a base 60 counting system and are best understood as schematic symbols of a founding golden age, not a literal census. Then the flood layers in the Mesopotamian mounds record real but local river floods, the ordinary catastrophes of life between two great and unpredictable rivers, not a single global deluge. The canyon's own layers are the patient work of shallow seas and deserts and deltas across hundreds of millions of years. Some of the best understood geology on the planet, needing no lost civilization to explain them. The giant skeletons of the old newspapers were never verified, never preserved for study, and are best explained as a mixture of misidentified animal bones, honest error, outright hoax, and the period's bottomless appetite for a marvel, and the genuine mound builders were the ancestors of the living native peoples, ordinary human beings whose real achievements were stolen from them by a culture that preferred a fantasy of vanished giants to the truth of the people it was displacing. And the restricted areas of the canyon are closed for the protection of fragile archaeology, for the genuine deadliness of the terrain, and for the sovereignty and sacred privacy of the tribes, all of which are real and sufficient reasons that require no conspiracy. And the ancient astronaut reading of the Sumerian texts, associated most famously with a popular author whose books sold in the millions, is rejected by essentially every professional scholar of the ancient Near East who has examined it on the grounds that it rests on mistranslations, on words made to mean things they do not mean, on a reading of poetry as engineering that the language itself will not support. All of that is true, and none of it should be waved away. And a person who ignores it is not being brave, they are being careless. The responsible position, the honest position, is that there is no verified physical evidence of a sealed alien city in the Grand Canyon, that the most famous account of one is almost certainly a fabrication, and that the mainstream explanations for the names, the numbers, the layers, and the texts are taken one at a time, entirely adequate. And yet, here's the thing that the full rebuttal, for all its force, does not quite dissolve, and it is the thing this documentary has been built around from the first minute. Every mainstream explanation works on a single piece. What none of them explains is the pattern, the way the pieces keep arranging themselves into the same shape across cultures and centuries that had no contact with one another. It explains why a geologist chose mythological names, but not why the shape of those particular myths, the sealed deep and the buried dead, matches the shape of a newspaper hoax written by a different man who had no reason to know the cuneiform sources, which in turn matches the shape of the oldest tablets on Earth, which in turn matches the traditions of the peoples native to the canyon, which in turn matches the flood memory of half the cultures on the planet. Coincidence explains any one link. It strains, and finally breaks somewhere in the middle of a chain that long. What you are left with, after every reasonable debunking has done its honest work, is not proof of a sealed city. It is something quieter and in its own way more unsettling. It is the recognition that the human race, across every barrier of language and time and distance, keeps telling the same story about the deep places of the world, and that the story is always a warning, and the warning is always the same. There is something below. It is sealed. Leave it sealed. Maybe that pattern is only a fact about us, about the shape of the human mind, about the fears that live in the oldest part of the brain and reach for the same images whenever we turn toward the dark under our feet. That is a real possibility, and perhaps the likeliest one. And it is not a small thing, because it would mean the warning is written not in the rock but in us, carried in every human being who has ever felt the wrongness of a deep dark opening in the ground without being able to say why. Or maybe, as the older and stranger reading insists, the pattern is a memory, worn down and scattered and half erased, of something that actually happened, a real sealing of a real deep by powers we no longer remember, remembered now only as the reflex that makes us name the abyss after the gods of the dead and tell each other, in 100 languages, to keep the door shut. I cannot tell you which it is. No one honest can. But I can tell you what the Sumerians would say, because they already said it, 4,000 years ago, on clay, in the oldest words we can still read. They would say that it does not finally matter whether the warning is written in the rock or in the blood, because either way it is written, and either way it says the same thing, and either way the wise response is the same. They warned us 7 times, from 7 directions, that there is a door in the deep, and that it was closed for a reason, and that the reason has not gone away. There is one more thing worth saying before we stand at the rim, and it is about us, about the sort of creature that would receive 7 warnings and feel, rising underneath the fear, the unmistakable pull to go and open the door anyway. Because that pull is real, and it is not rare, and it is one of the most consistent things about the human animal. Every culture that ever told a story about a sealed and forbidden thing also told a story about someone who could not leave it shut. There is the box that must not be opened, and every trouble in the world let loose. There is the locked room the new bride is forbidden to enter, entered, and the horror inside found. Yet there is the tomb that must not be disturbed, and the curse that follows the ones who broke the seal. Over and over, across every people, the human race tells itself the same paired story. Here is a thing that must stay closed, and here is one of us who opened it, and here is the price. We tell that story so often because it is a story about what we are. We are the creature that opens things. But we are the ones who cannot bear a sealed door, who feel a shut container as a question demanding an answer, who look at a warning that says, "Do not go down," and feel our feet already turning toward the stairs. The Sumerians knew this about us. Gilgamesh is that story. Adapa is that story. The whole tradition of the 7 warnings is addressed, urgently, to a listener the writers clearly expected, would want, more than anything, to ignore them. And that is exactly why the warnings were made to last. You do not carve a message into clay and bury it to survive the ages for a reader you expect to obey easily. You do it for a reader you are afraid will need to be told again and again in every generation, because the impulse to open the door never dies out. It only sleeps between the ones bold enough to act on it. The 7 warnings are not written for a careful and obedient species. They are written for us, the door openers, the seal breakers, the ones who go down. And in our own age, of all ages, that should land with particular weight, because we are the generation that has learned to open almost everything, to split the atom and read the gene and dig the buried libraries out of the ground and reach our instruments into every deep and dark place left on the planet and beyond it. We are very good at opening. We have never been sure we are wise. And the 7th warning was written precisely for a people who could open the last door and might not stop to ask, until after, whether it should have stayed shut. So, what do you do with a warning like that? Not the sealed complex in the wall, which may never have existed, but the warning itself, the one that survived the drowning of the world to reach you. You could go looking. People have. There are those who spend their lives convinced the door in the canyon wall is real and out there, waiting to be found, and who mean to find it. But understand what that would require and what it would cost. The remote depths of that canyon are protected now, some of them closed entirely, for reasons that are real and sufficient and have nothing to do with hidden cities, the fragility of ancient sites, the genuine deadliness of the terrain, and the sovereignty and the sacred privacy of the peoples whose home this is and has been for longer than any records but their own. To go clawing into the sealed places of that canyon in search of a vault would be to trespass on the dead, on the living, and on the law, and to do it in service of a story that the honest weight of the evidence says is almost certainly not true. The 7th warning, if you have understood it at all, does not send you toward the door. It teaches you why some doors are left closed, and it asks you to be, for once, the rarest kind of human being, the one who receives the warning and heeds it, the one who stands at the top of the stairs and does not go down. So stand at the rim one last time, in the early light, and look out across the canyon at the temples of the drowned gods rising out of the haze, Isis and Osiris and the Tower of Ra and the Dark Tower of Set, and down past them a mile into the shadow where the cold water comes out of the wall and the oldest stone on the continent lies folded in the dark, named for the sleeping preserver on the cosmic waters. Somewhere down there, if an old and stubborn story holds even a grain of truth, there is a door in the rock, and behind it the sealed chambers, and at the heart of them the crypt of the tiered dead. And whether that door is real stone, or only the oldest shape in the human mind, the 7 warnings agree on what it is for, and on what happens if it is ever forced, and on the one instruction that the first writers on earth took the trouble to bake into clay, so that it would survive the drowning of their world and reach all the way to us. There is a door in the deep. It was sealed on purpose. Leave it closed.